You fool! Warren is dead. Welcome to HorrorBabble. Today we've put another collection together for you. Outsiders, those who do not belong. The collection consists of 7 stories, each of which represents an interpretation of the term outsider. As always, chapter times can be found in the video description below. And without further ado, Far Below by Robert Barber Johnson. With a roar and a howl, the thing was upon us, out of total darkness. Involuntarily I drew back as its headlights passed, and every object in the little room rattled from the reverberations. Then the power car was by, and there was only the clackety-clack of wheels and lighted windows flickering past like bits of film on a badly connected projection machine. I caught glimpses of occupants briefly. Bleak-eyed men sitting miserably on hard benches, a pair of lovers oblivious to the hour's lateness and all else, an old bearded man in a black cap, sound asleep, conductors here and there too, their uniforms black splotches against the blaze of car lights. Then red tail lamps shot by, and the roar died to an earthquake rumble far down the track. "The 3-1 Express," my friend said quietly. "From the Battery. On time to the minute, too. It's the last, until nearly dawn." He spoke briefly into a telephone, saying words I could not catch, for the racket of the train was still in my ears. I occupied the interval by staring about me. There was so much to be seen in the little room, such a strange diversity of apparatus, switches and coils and curious mechanisms, charts and graphs and piles of documents, and, dominating all, the great black board on which a luminous worm seemed to crawl, inching along past the dotted lines labelled 49th Street, 52nd Street, 58th Street, 60th. "A new wrinkle, that," my friend said. He had put down his phone and was watching the board with me. "Lord, I don't dare think what it cost to install. It's not just a chart, It actually records. Invisible lights. The sort of things that open speakeasy doors and rich men's garages. Pairs of them spaced approximately every 25 yards along 5 miles of subway tunnel. Figure that out on paper and the total you'll get will seem hardly believable. And yet the city passed the appropriation for them without a murmur. It was one of the last things Mayor Walker put up before his resignation. "Gentlemen," he said to the finance board, "it doesn't matter what you think about me, but this measure must go through." And it did. There wasn't a murmur of protest, though the city was almost broke at the time. "What's the matter, man? You're looking queer." "I'm feeling queer," I said. "Do you mean to say the thing goes that far back, to Walker's time?" He laughed. It was a strange laugh that died eerily amid the dying echoes of the train far down the tunnel. "Good Lord," he gasped. "To his time. Man, Walker hadn't served his first term as mayor when this thing started. It goes back to World War days, and even before that. The wreck of the train, I recall, passed as a German spy plot to keep us from going in with the Allies. The newspapers howled bloody murder about alleged confessions and evidence they claimed they had. We let 'em howl, of course. Why not? America was as good as in the war anyhow by then. And if we told the people of New York City what really wrecked that subway train, well, the horrors of Chateau Thierry and Verdun and all of the rest of them put together wouldn't have equaled the shambles that rioting mobs would have made of this place. People just couldn't stand the thought of it, They'd go mad if they knew what was down here, far below." The silence was worse than the roar had been, I thought. The strange, echoing, somehow pregnant silence of empty vastness. Only the drip-drip of water from some subterranean leak broke it. That and the faint crackling noise the indicator made as its phosphorescent crawling hinted at 68th Street, 72nd, 78th. Yes, my friend said slowly. They'd go mad if they knew. And sometimes I wonder why we don't go mad down here, we who do know and have to face the horror down here night after night and year after year. I think it's only because we don't really face it that we get by, because we never quite define the thing in our own minds objectively. We just sort of let things hang in the air, you might say. We don't speak of what we're guarding against by name. We just call it them or one of them, Take them for granted just as we took the enemy overseas as something that's just down here and has to be fought. I think if we ever really did let our minds get to brooding on what they are, it'd be all over for us. Human flesh and blood couldn't stand it, Couldn't stand it. He brooded, staring out into the tunnel's darkness. The indicator crackled faintly on the wall. 92nd Street, 98th, 101st. Beyond 120th Street, things are pretty safe. I heard my friend's voice as I watched. When the train reaches that point, you'll see a green light flash, all clear. Though that doesn't mean absolute safety, you understand. It's just what we've established as the farthest reach of their activities. They may extend them at any time, although so far they haven't done so. There seems to be something circumscribed about their minds, They're creatures of habit. That must be what it is that's kept them in this one little stretch of tunnel with all the vast interlocking network of New York's subway system to rove in if they chose. I can't think of any other explanation, unless you want to get into the supernatural and say it's because they're bound to this particular locality by some sort of mystical laws. Perhaps because it's lower than the other tunnels, chiseled far down into the basic bedrock of Manhattan, and so near to the East River you can almost hear the water lapping on quiet nights. Or maybe it's just the awful dankness of the tunnel here, the fungoid moisture and miasmic darkness that suits them. At all events, they don't come up anywhere else except along this stretch. And we've got the lights and the patrol cars and 3 way stations like this one with 10 men on constant duty from dark till dawn. Oh yes, my boy. It's quite a little army I command down here in the night watches. An army of the unburied dead, you might say. Or an army of the eternally damned. I've actually had one of my men go mad, 2 others had to be placed in sanitariums for a while, but they got over it and are serving here still. But this fellow, well, we had to machine gun him down like a dog finally, or he'd have got one of us. That was before we got the dark lights placed, you see, and he was able to hide out in the tunnel for days without our being able to find him. We'd hear him howl sometimes as we patrolled, and see his eyes shining just as their eyes do in the darkness. So we knew that he was quite gone. So when we finally ran him down, we killed him, just like that. No bones made about it. Put, 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 and that was the end. We buried him down in the tunnel, too, and now the trains run over him as he lies. Oh, there was nothing irregular about the business. We filled out full departmental reports and got the consent of his relatives and so on. Only we just couldn't take the poor fellow above ground and run risks of people seeing him before interment. You see, there were certain alterations. I don't want to dwell on it, but his face, well, the change was just beginning, of course, but it was quite unmistakable, quite dehumanizing, There would have been some excitement up there, I'm afraid, just at sight of that face. And there were other details, things I only found out when I dissected his body. But I think I'd rather not go into them either, old boy, if you don't mind. The whole point is we have to be rather careful down here, all of us in the special detail. That's why we have such unusual working conditions. We wear police uniforms, of course, but we aren't subject to ordinary police discipline. Lord, What would an above-ground cop make of having every other night off and every day all to himself, and with a salary that, well, a corporal down here gets as much as does an inspector up there? But at that I think we earn our pay. I know I do. Of course I can't tell you what my salary is. They made me promise never to disclose it when they hired me from the Natural History Museum back in... Well, I don't like to think about how long ago that was. I was Professor Gordon Craig in those days, you know, instead of Inspector Craig of NYPD. And I just returned from Carl Akeley's first African expedition after guerrillas. That was why they brought the thing to me for examination, you see, after that first big wreck in the subway that had only been open less than a year. They'd found it pinned down in the wreckage, screaming in agony from their lights on its dead white eyeballs. Indeed, it seemed to have died from the lights as much as from anything else. Organically, it was sound enough, save for a broken bone or two. Well, they brought it to me because I was supposed to be the museum's leading authority on apes. And I examined it. Believe me, I examined it, old boy. I went for 6 days and nights without sleep or even rest, analyzing that dead corpse down to its last rag of bone and hank of hair. No scientist on this earth ever had a chance like that before, and I was making the best of it. I found out all there was to be found before I collapsed over my laboratory table and had to be taken to the hospital. Of course, long before that, I had told them the thing wasn't an ape. There was vaguely anthropoid structure, all right, and the blood corpuscles were almost human, quite shockingly so. But the head and the spade-like appendages and the muscular development were quite unlike any beast or man on this earth. Indeed, the thing had never been on this earth. There was no doubt of that. It would have died above ground in half a minute, just like an angleworm in the sun. And I'm afraid my report to the authorities didn't help them much. After all, even a fellow scientist would have found it a bit difficult to reconcile my classification of some sort of giant, carrion-feeding subterranean mole with my ravings about canine and simian developments of members and my absurd insistence on startlingly humanoid cranial development and brain convolutions indicating a degree of intelligence that... Well, there's no use going into all that now. I firmly expected them to order me up before a sanity commission when I reported my findings. Instead, they offered me a position as head of the special subway detail, at a salary that was, to say the least, fantastic. It was more a month than I'd been getting a year from the museum. Because, you see, they'd deduced much of the stuff for themselves without needing me to tell them. They had facts they deliberately withheld from me, not wanting to influence my report. They knew that train had been deliberately derailed. The mutilated track proved that beyond all doubt. No less than 3 ties had been taken up and laid some distance away down the tunnel, and the condition of the earth about the wrecked cars showed conclusively that extensive mining and sapping had taken place there. It was like a gigantic molehill, only worse. While I'd been analyzing stomach fluids and body tissue to try to find out what my subject fed upon, they'd been burying, secretly and with most elaborate precautions, the half-desiccated corpses of 6 men and women and children who, well, they hadn't died in the wreck, old boy. They hadn't died in the wreck any more than had that screaming thing that hid its eyes from the lights when they found it, pinned in the wreckage, where it had been caught while trying to drag a dead victim out. God, what a hideous shambles that place must have been before the wrecking crews got there. Mercifully, of course, there was total darkness. The poor devils who were merely injured never knew what charnel horrors were going on in the Stygian depths about them, nor cared, no doubt, in their agony. A few of them gibbered afterward about green eyes and claws that raked their faces, but of course all that was set down to delirium. Even one man who had his arm chewed half off never knew. Surgeons amputated the rest immediately and told him when he regained consciousness that he'd lost it in the wreck. He's still walking the streets today, blissfully ignorant of what almost happened to him that night. Oh, you'd be surprised, old boy, how you can hush a thing up if you've got a whole city administration behind you. And believe me, we did hush matters up. No newspaper reporter was ever allowed to see the wreck, freedom of the press or no freedom of the press. The government wanted to appoint a commission to investigate. We squelched it, and by the time the crews had cleaned out the smashed train and removed the last victim, the special subway detail had gone into action, and it's been on steady duty ever since, for the last 20-odd years. We had a terrible time at first, of course. All these modern improvements weren't available then. All we had were lanterns and guns and handcars, with which to patrol nearly 5 miles of tunnel. It was Mrs. Partington sweeping back the sea all over again, only worse. A handful of puny mortals against hell itself, in the eternal darkness of these long, gloomy tunnels far below the city. There were no more wrecks after we took over, though. I'll say that much. Oh, an accident or two. How could we prevent them? We did everything we could think of. How we worked in those early years. Once we sank a shaft 50 feet deep in the earth, where we'd seen queer disturbances beside the train tracks and heard queerer sounds. And once we blocked up both ends of the tunnel for a mile stretch and filled it with poison gas. And once we dynamited, but why go on? It was all useless, utterly useless. We just couldn't get to grips with anything tangible. Though, we'd hear sounds sometimes on our long, dismal patrols in the darkness. Our little lanterns, mere pinpricks of light in these vast old concrete vaults. We'd catch glimpses of glinting eyes far off, find fresh earth piled up where only a moment before there had been hard-packed cinders and gravel. Once in a while we'd fire our guns at something whitish and half-seen, but there'd be only a tittering laugh in answer, a laugh as mirthless and savage as that of a hyena dying away in the earth. 1,000 times I was tempted to chuck the whole thing, to get back above ground to sunshine and sanity and forget the charnel horrors of this mad Nyarlathotep world far underneath. And then I'd get to thinking of all those helpless men and women and children riding the trains unsuspecting through the haunted dark, with evil out of the primeval dawn burrowing beneath them for their destruction. And, well, I just couldn't go, that's all. I stayed and did my duty as the rest did, year after year after year. It's been a strange career for a man of science, and certainly one I never dreamed I'd be following during all the years I prepared myself for museum work. And yet I flatter myself that it's been rather a socially useful career at that. Perhaps more so than stuffing animals for dusty museum cases or writing monstrous textbooks that no one ever bothers to read. For I've a science of my own down here, you know. The science of keeping millions of dollars worth of subway tunnels swept clean of horror, and of safeguarding the lives of half the population of the world's largest city. And then, too, I've opportunities for research here, which most of my colleagues above ground would give their right arms for. The opportunity to study an absolutely unknown form of life, a grotesquerie so monstrous that even after all these years of contact with it, I sometimes doubt my own senses even now, although the horror's authentic enough if you come right down to it. It's been attested in every country in the world and by every people. Why, even the Bible has references to the ghouls that burrow in the earth, and even today in modern Persia they hunt down with dogs and guns like beasts, strange tomb-dwelling creatures neither quite human nor quite beast, and in Syria and Palestine and parts of Russia. But as for this particular place, well, you'd be surprised how many records we found, how many actual evidences of the things we've uncovered from Manhattan Island's earliest history, even before the white men settled here. Ask the curator of the Aborigines Museum out on Riverside Drive about the burial customs of island Indians 1,000 years ago. Customs perfectly inexplicable, unless you take into consideration what they were guarding against. and ask him to show you that skull, half human and half canine, that came out of an Indian mound as far away as Albany, and those ceremonial robes of aboriginal shamans plainly traced with drawings of whitish, spidery things burrowing through conventionalized tunnels, and doing other things too, that show the Indian artists must have known them and their habits. Oh yes, it's all down there in black and white, once we had the sense to read it. And even after white men came, what about the early writings of the old Dutch settlers? What about Jan van der Ries and Wouter van Twiller? Even some of Washington Irving's writings have a nasty twist to them, if you once realize it. And there are some mighty queer passages in The History of the City of New York, mention of guard patrols kept for no rational purpose in early streets at night, particularly in the region of cemeteries, of forays and excursions in the lightless dark, and flintlocks popping, and graves hastily dug and filled in before dawn woke the city to life. And then the modern writers, Lord, there's a whole library of them on the subject. One of them, a great student of the subject, had almost as much data on them from his reading as I gleaned from my years of study down here. Oh yes, I learned a lot from Lovecraft, and he got a lot from me too. That's where what you might call the authenticity came from in some of his yarns that attracted the most attention. Oh, of course he had to soft-pedal the strongest parts of it, just as you're going to have to do if you ever mention this in your own writings. But even with the worst played down, there's still enough horror and nightmare in it to blast a man's soul if he lets himself think on what goes on down there, below the blessed sanity of the earth's mercifully concealing crust, far below. We figured out, we who've been studying them all this time, that they must have been pretty numerous once. No wonder the Indians sold this place so cheaply. You'd sell your home cheaply, too, if it were fairly overrun with monstrous, noxious vermin that... But with civilization's coming, they were decimated, killed off, pogromed against, blasted with fire and steel by men whose utter ruthlessness sprang from soul-shattering detestation, who slew and kept silent about their slaying, lest their fellow men think them mad, until finally the blasted remnant of the things went far underground, burrowed down like worms to charnel depths that, well, we daren't conjecture just where, but we think that there's some fault in the basic bedrock of the island, some monstrous cavern whose edge this lowest of all the subway tunnels taps, and which lets them through somehow into the tubes. Oh, it took us a long time to find all that out. At first we thought we had to patrol the whole subway system of the city. We had guards even out onto the river and over in Brooklyn and Queens. We were even afraid they'd get into upper levels of the tunnels, perhaps into the very deserted streets of Manhattan during the pre-dawn hours. We had half the police department down here in those days, even the mounted force. Yes, indeed. Though God knows what even a trained police horse would do if it ever came face to face with one of those things. But horses were faster than the handcars we used then, and could cover more territory. But as time went on, we got things pretty well localized. It's only in this one stretch of tunnel that the danger is, and only here in certain hours of the night. Don't ask me why they never come up in daylight, for it's always night down here, you know, hundreds of feet below the surface. Maybe it's the constant passage of the trains. They shuttle by at 2-minute intervals all day long, you know, and until the Broadway theaters close at night. Only for about 4 hours of the night is there a lull when long miles of tunnel are lifeless and deserted and silent, when anything could come and go at will in them and not to be seen. And so it's only during these hours that we really worry, you see. It's only now that we're vigilant and ready. Although, of course, it's no longer warfare, you understand. We hunt them now. They don't hunt us anymore. We run them down, howling with terror, kill them or capture them as we will. Oh, yes, I said capture. A half-dozen times we've had a sort of mad Bronx zoo of our own down here, Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say a living Madame Tussaud's chamber of horrors. I have cages in my laboratory, and there have been times when it seemed judicious for influential people above ground to realize just how important is the work we're doing down here. So, when we have a really stubborn skeptic to our program, we take him in there, hand him a flashlight, and let him train it himself on what was prisoned there in total darkness, and then we'd stand by to catch him as he fainted. Oh, a lot of city officials and politicians have been down here. Why not? They couldn't possibly speak of the experience afterward. They'd just be locked up as lunatics if they did. And it made them much more liberal about funds. Our menagerie was a great success, only we just couldn't keep it going for very long at a time. We'd get so soul-sick at the very proximity of the creatures that we'd have to kill them finally. There was just no putting up with them for any length of time. Oh, it's not so much the appearance of the things, or even what they eat. We got an unlimited supply of that from the city morgue, and to anyone who spent half his life in dissecting rooms as I have, it might be a lot worse. But there's a sort of cosmic horror the things exude that, it's quite beyond description. You just can't breathe the same air with them, live together in the same sane world. And in the end, we'd have to gun them and throw them back underground to their friends and neighbors, who were waiting for them, apparently. At least we've opened the shallow graves a few days later, and there'd be only a gnawed bone or two there. And then, of course, we kept them alive in order to study their habits. I filled 2 volumes with notes from my successors, who'll carry on the fight when I'm gone. Oh yes, old boy. It'll always have to be carried on, I fear. There's no possibility of ever really wiping them out, you know. All we can do is hold our own. The fight will go on so long as this particular tunnel is occupied. Can't you just see the city fathers consenting to abandon $20 million worth of subway tunnels for nothing? I'm sorry, gentlemen, but you see, the place is infested with... God, what a laughingstock anyone would be who even suggested that above ground. Why, even on our own furloughs, when we walk sunlit streets among our fellow men, with God's own blue sky above and God's own clean air about us, even we wonder whether all this foulness isn't just a bad dream. It's hard up there to realize what can go on down in the crepuscular earth, the mad, gnawing, eternal darkness far below. Hello? The telephone was ringing. Somehow I didn't listen as he spoke briefly into it, perhaps because I was listening to something else, to a faint crackling from that great blackboard on the wall, where one little light, no glowing worm this time, but only one minute spark, kept flicking oddly on and off and on again. 79th Street, it marked, over and over. 79th Street, 79th. My friend hung up the phone at length and stood up. Queer, he said softly. Very queer indeed. The first in months, and tonight now while we were talking. It makes one wonder, you know, about those supernatural telepathic powers that they're said to have. Something went past in the tunnel outside, something that moved so fast that I could scarcely make it out, just a little low platform on 4 wheels, with no visible engine to propel it. Yet it scudded along with the speed of a racing car. Uniformed men rode the bucking thing, crouching with glinting objects in their hands. Riot car number 1, my friend said grimly. Our own version of the squad automobiles above ground. Just one of the little electric handcars used in subway construction, but souped up by our engineers until it'll do nearly 80 miles an hour. It could traverse the entire sector in less than 5 minutes if it had to. But it doesn't, of course. Another one, also with machine gunners aboard, left 105th Street at the same time. They'll meet somewhere along the tunnel's length with the disturbance in between. Let's listen to them. He crossed the room to the strange apparatus, threw switches and adjusted dials. There was a burring and crackling from what looked like an old-fashioned radio amplifier that stood on one of the cabinets. Microphones every 100 feet along the tunnel," said my friend. "Another small fortune to install, of course, but another great step forward in our efficiency. A man listens all night long at a switchboard, and you'd be surprised to know what he hears sometimes. We have to change operators pretty often. Ah, there we are. Microphone number 290, approximately 1,000 feet below one of the busiest corners, even at this hour of the night, in all a great metropolis. And listen. Hear that? That was a sound that brought me out of my chair, a strange high tittering, blasphemously off-key that merged into a growl and a moan. "There we are," my friend grated. "One of them, certainly. Perhaps more than one. Hear that scratching and the rustle of the gravel? All unsuspecting, of course, that they're broadcasting their presence, unaware that we modern human beings have got ourselves a few supernatural powers of our own nowadays, and unaware that, from both directions, death is sweeping down upon them on truckling wheels. But a little moment more, and... Ah! Hear that shriek, that howling? That means they've sighted one of the cars. They're fleeing madly along the tunnel now. The voices get fainter. And now... Yes, now they double back. The other car. They're trapped, caught between them. No time to dig, to burrow down into their saving Mother Earth like the vermin they are. No, you devils, we've got you. Got you. Hear 'em yell? Hear 'em shriek in agony? That's the lights, you know. Blazing searchlights trained on dark accustomed bodies. Burning, searing, withering them like actual blazing heat. And now, brr, rat-tat-tat. That's our machine guns going into action. Silenced guns with Maxims on them so that the echoes won't carry to upper levels and make men ask questions, but throwing slugs of lead, for all that, into cringing white bodies and flattened white skulls. Shriek! Shriek, you beasts from hell! Shriek, you monsters from the charnel depths! Shriek on and see what good it does you! You're dead! 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 Well, you blasted fool, what are you staring at? To save my life, I couldn't have answered him. I couldn't look away from his blazing eyes, from his body crouched as if he would spring at me across the room, from his teeth bared in a bestial snarl. For a long moment that tableau held. Then suddenly he dropped into a chair, flung his hands up over his face. I stood regarding him, my mind sickly ticking off details. God, why had I not seen them before? That lengthening of jaw, that flattening of forehead and cranium. No human head could be shaped like that. At last he spoke, not looking up. "I know," he said softly. "I felt the change coming on me for a long time now. It's coming over all of us, bit by bit, but on me the worst, for I've been here the longest. That's why I almost never go above ground anymore, even on leave. The lights are dim down here, but I wouldn't dare let even you see my face in sunlight. 25 years, you see. 25 long, dragging years down here in hell itself. It was bound to leave a mark, of course. I was prepared for that. But, oh, great powers above, if I'd for one instant dream what it was to be. Worse, oh, how much worse than any mark of the beast. And it's spiritual, you know, as well as physical. I get cravings sometimes down here in the night's loneliness, thought and charnel desires that would blast your very soul if I were to whisper them to you. And they'll get worse, I know, and worse until at last I run mad in the tunnel like that poor devil I told you about, and my men shoot me down like a dog, as they already have orders to do. And yet the thing interests me, I'll admit. It interests me scientifically, even though it horrifies my very soul, even though it damns me forever. For it shows how they may have come about, must have come about, in fact, in the world's dim dawn. Perhaps never quite human, of course. Perhaps never Neanderthal, or even Piltdown. Something even lower, closer linked to the primeval beast, but that when driven underground, into caves and then beneath them by man's coming, retrograded century by uncounted century down to the worm-haunted darkness, just as we poor devils are retrograding down here from very contact with them, until at last none of us will ever be able again to walk above in the blessed sunlit air among our fellow men. With a roar and a howl, the thing was upon us out of total darkness. Instinctively I drew back as its headlights passed. Every object in the little room rattled from the reverberation. Then the power car was by, and there was only the clackety-clack of wheels and lighted windows flicking by like bits of film on a badly connected projection machine. "The 4:15 Express," he said heavily, "from the Bronx. Safe and sound, you'll notice, its occupants all unsuspecting of how they were safeguarded, of how they'll always be safeguarded. But at what a cost, at what an awful cost. The 4:15 Express. That means it's dawn, you know, in the city overhead. Rays of the rising sun are gilding the white skyscrapers of Manhattan. The whole great city begins to wake to morning life. But there's no dawn for us down here, of course. There'll never be a dawn for poor lost souls down here in the eternal dark, far, far below." It All Came True in the Woods by Manly Wade Wellman. When the horror, passing speech, hunted us along, each laid hold on each, and each found the other strong. In the teeth of things forbid and reason overthrown, Helen stood by me, she did, Helen all alone. Rudyard Kipling. Helen took long steps to keep up with her father. Her chubby face, solemn in its pointed blue hood, turned up to him.
"What are these woods called, Daddy?"
she asked for the 5th time. "The Indians called them Amasukit," Clay said patiently, blowing out blue smoke on the brisk autumn air. "Can't you remember, Helen? You're 6 now, and you recited Horatius for the people at the cabin last night."
"Horatius is easy,"
Helen explained, as her short legs in ski pants made hoppy haste to stay beside her father.
"Amasukit,"
And she achieved it at last.
"is not. That's foreign."
She was silent, catching her breath, and Clay slowed to a saunter. No sense in wearing the child out, and the walk along this trail was too beautiful to hurry anyway. The brush that fenced them in on either hand offered every fall tint that was richest and brightest: lemon, peach, orange, scarlet, royal purple. As for the trees of the wood, taller and more distant, they might have been a sea-floor garden with their welters of warm red and gold clamped on their boughs. "No, it isn't foreign, Helen," laughed Clay. "Why, the Indians were the first Americans. They lived here for ages, before our people ever thought about the Mayflower."
"Before George Washington?"
That was Helen's ultimate conception of antiquity. Ever so long before, they had a right to name these woods.
"What does the name mean, Daddy?"
Clay drew on his pipe. It was a favorite of his, a big, bold English briar. Quite a time would pass, he mused, before he'd be buying any more pipes in England, what with the war and all. Helen was tugging at his hand to hurry the answer. "Why, I've told you that too," he reminded. "Amasukit, the trees of truth, because the Indians believed that any word spoken here came true."
"Ooh."
Helen was again intrigued. She liked outings of any kind, and had danced when her parents took the cabin on the edge of this forest reserve for fall weekends. Now, if the place had a story attached...
"All words come true,"
she repeated with relish.
"You mean like fairies and dwarfs?"
"Exactly," nodded Clay with the utmost gravity. Imaginative himself, he encouraged when he could any romancing his little daughter might attempt. "Fairies and dwarfs."
"Ooh!"
squealed Helen again, and glanced around searchingly.
"Daddy, there was a dwarf right there, with a long beard and a red cap, peeking out from under that bush."
She pointed excitedly. Clay smiled down at her and led the way around a bend of the trail. The shrubbery was thicker here, and its coloring even richer. Moss made the earth green under their boot soles. It was something to see, then, Clay remarked, still grave. He knew some parents, and despised them, who would call any child who claimed to see dwarfs a liar. But Clay remembered his own childhood, the vividness of his games and imaginings. Helen put her hands in her jacket pockets, imitating her father.
Are there witches here, too?
She pursued her inquiries. No. Her father would like to rule such thoughts out, ever since a night of awful dreams after Betty had heard some Halloween tales. Whatever witches there were in this country got driven away by Cotton Mather, you know.
Is Cotton Mather here?
She asked at once. Cotton Mather is in heaven, said Clay. Let's stop while Daddy fills his pipe. Waiting, Helen glanced up at the half-hazy sky, as though she expected to see the old Puritan divine look out at her, dwarf fashion.
Well,
she said,
are there giants in these woods?
Tamping down the tobacco in the bowl, Clay held a match to it. He shrugged in defeat. What can you do with kids? They simply throve on stories of excitement and danger and terror. He and Mrs. Clay had tried to hold Helen down to gentle fantasies like Peter Rabbit, but Helen's taste ran stubbornly to Red Riding Hood's wolf and even grimmer gentry. It came to Clay that in keeping the stories mild, he might be frustrating an instinct. That would be bad. What did J.G. Fraser have to say about such childhood tastes, or Irvin S. Cobb, or Freud? Clay decided not to deprive Helen further of giants. Bad dreams tonight would be on his own head. Oh, yes, indeed, he nodded. The trees of truth would be full of giants, big ones.
Bigger than you?
Suggested Helen, who considered her father to be of tremendous stature. Much bigger, darling, and bigger than Uncle Frank, or the football boys you saw last week. Twice, 3 or 4 times as big, taller than those trees yonder. Helen glanced at the trees and shivered.
How many eyes do they have?
She almost whispered. Only 1 eye apiece, improvised Clay promptly, remembering the Cyclops who imprisoned Ulysses. 1 eye in the middle of the forehead. But, on the other hand, they have each 2 or 3 rows of teeth, sometimes more, and as sharp as swords, and shaggy beards. She glanced over her shoulder at the trees and grew pale.
I'm afraid of them,
she said. But Clay had been thinking hard and fast to deal with just such a contingency. Don't worry, he told her. The giants can't hurt us, not when Daddy smokes this magic pipe all the way from England. He blew out a great cloud of blue vapor by way of punctuation, because giants are afraid of it.
Really, truly?
And Helen squinted hopefully at the pipe. Oh, yes, terribly afraid. They'd never dare come near enough to touch us. Clay began to mix in fragments of half-forgotten Indian lore, learned a generation ago in Boy Scout camp. You see, the old Indians used tobacco for a charm. Their medicine men smoked it to drive away bad things, spirits and witches and so on. Giants are bad things, just about the worst. They hate the smell of tobacco, especially, and he exhaled a bigger cloud, when it's a magic pipe, like Daddy's. Helen glanced at the trees once more, but not pallidly this time. Her chin was squared.
Well then, I won't be afraid of those old giants over there,
she announced sturdily. At her games again, thought Clay. Good girl, he applauded. Let's sit down here on this nice soft rock, and I'll tell you more things. He had meant to turn the conversation to the autumn colors of the leaves, discussing them in simple terms Helen's 6-year-old mind might digest. But as she took a seat beside him, she had no such idea.
What do giants wear, Daddy?
She continued on the subject which just now preoccupied her. They wear skins. He smiled down at her. Deerskins and bearskins, sewed together like patchwork, to make a piece big enough to cover them. Her eyes were still fixed on the middle distance beyond the brush.
What kind of shoes?
No shoes, of course. Their feet are too big for shoes, aren't they now?
I suppose so,
agreed Helen seriously.
I can't see their feet from here. What do giants eat?
Men, said Clay impressively.
Men who don't have magic pipes?
Yes. To comfort her, Clay blew smoke. Nobody had better come among the giants without tobacco.
They look scared,
announced Helen, and stood up as if to get a better view of something.
Look at them, Daddy.
Yes, you're right, nodded Clay, stooping to pick up a very brilliant maple leaf. Now, take this to Mummy when we get back, dear. Say that it's a souvenir of this walk in the woods.
You're not looking, Daddy. Not looking at the giants.
Helen was pointing insistently. To fall in with her humor, Clay lifted his head and looked. There were 3 of them, and not more than 30 yards away, taller than the topmost branches of the gorgeous red and gold trees. Clay could see them from the waist upward, above the thick trailside brush, lumpy, hairy, skin-clad, like the ugliest of colossal statues come to life. 2 had beards, one black, the other grizzled and blonde, and the third wore long gun braids hanging like lengths of cable at either side of a gross, hairless face the width of a bureau. So Helen had not been imagining giants after all. In the back of a brain that throbbed and whirled, Clay fenced off a tiny corner for what sensible thoughts he could summon. No time now, he told himself, to wonder how or why. The necessity was to get away, get Helen away at least. Without rising from where he sat, he caught Helen's shoulder and pressed her back and back, sliding her off the stone. "Darling," he said, wondering why his voice remained steady. "There are bushes near us. Crawl under them, far under. If there are thorny branches, get under those. Don't move or make a noise until Daddy has made those things go away from here. When you can't see or hear them anymore, get up and run back along this trail we came. Get to the cabin. Once you start running, don't stop." He heard the dry leaves rustle as she silently obeyed. She was doing her part. Now he must do his. Springing up suddenly, as high into the air as he could, he flourished both arms over his head. At the top of his voice, he yelled, "Hi! Hi! Hi!" From his gaping mouth, the pipe dropped, bouncing on the mossy ground beside the rock. Clay turned and ran his fastest down trail. At almost the same moment he heard a mighty crashing, as of elephants among the timber. He permitted himself one backward look. The 3 great towers of flesh had sprung through the brushy hedge and were lumbering after him. All 3. None had paused to hunt for Helen. He felt a thrill of elation. Thus the parent partridge saves its hidden young, by diverting danger and pursuit after itself. He flourished his arms and yelled again. Then he saved his breath for running. No use. Their legs were longer than his entire body. One of their strides made 4 of his. Behind, then above, he heard a furnace-like panting. A grip fastened upon him, fingers as long as his arms. He was lifted from the ground in mid-career. The air rang with a deep, stormy growl, a concert of prodigious laughter. After one convulsive struggle, like a chicken in the jaws of a fox, Clay made himself go slack. He might have a chance later. Had best save his strength for that. If there was no chance, a doomed man should have dignity. The 3 gathered and exulted grossly over him, the 2 giants and the giantess. To them he was smaller than Helen would be to him, like a doll or a baby. He saw at close hand their eyes. Each had but the one, deep set in the middle of the low forehead, as large as tennis balls. Their mouths like open satchels, all studded inside with rows of pointed, sharky teeth, their hairiness, their patchwork skin garments, their bare feet like toe-fringed bolsters. Dangling in mid-air, Clay recognized his own handiwork. Among the Amasukit, the trees of truth, any spoken word became fact. The idle improvisations of a father diverting his little one had taken shape, flesh, life. The one who held him was the oldest, with a mat of buckskin beard turning grey. Some of his myriad teeth were broken. This captor grunted to the younger Blackbeard and the terrible woman mountain with the braids. The dark giant drew from his girdle thong a stone knife as long as a scythe, with which he began to whittle. First he uprooted a cedar sapling, and pared away its branches with powerful slashing digs of his blade. Then he sharpened the tip like a pencil. Beside the trail lay a fallen trunk of pine, dead and beginning to rot. Setting down his pole, the young giant caught this log in his huge hands, and with a single humping of his muscles wrenched it in two lengthwise. Kneeling, he set the sharpened point of cedar upon the exposed inside of one slab, and began twirling the stake briskly between his palms. Thus spun, the point drilled a hole. Woodmeal crawled out. It smoked from the friction, glowed. The giantess, with a fistful of shredded bark, evoked a flame that greatened and put forth smudge, fire made by rubbing sticks. Fire for what? Beneath big skillful hands the fuel quickly caught. The flames grew and climbed. The grizzled monster that held Clay nodded his big bushy head in approval. It was a cooking fire. His huge captor lifted him. The cedar point turned toward his stomach. The other two giants watched with relish, and the tongue of the giantess, like a red banner, came into view to moisten her lips. This, Clay thought with the corner of his brain kept sensible, was an end that nobody would ever believe. He would never be seen again. Helen, back at the cabin, would tell a story that would not make sense, even if searchers found his bones, stripped and crushed.
"You let my daddy alone,"
commanded someone close at hand. The voice was young, shrill and indignant. Clay, bracing himself to feel the crushing impalement of the cedar stake, knew that voice, and in despair counted his sacrifice as useless. Helen hadn't hidden, hadn't escaped. She had followed his abhorrent captors, was coming among them.
"Let him alone,"
she was repeating.
"Or I'll—"
There was deadly, confident menace in her little girl voice. The grizzled giant lowered both his hands, with the spit in one and Clay in the other. His huge, single eye widened and protruded grossly. The firelight made it gleam like a very nasty jewel. The fulvid tangle of beard parted. The open mouth writhed over the rows of broken fangs. Clay managed to turn his head as he hung in the prisoning grip. He had never realized how small Helen was, how frail. She seemed barely as long as any one of the great bare feet among which she had planted herself. Her arms were set akimbo, her head flung back so that the hood drooped from it, her eyes glittered. So Clay had seen her often before, when her young temper was up. Only one thing was really strange about Helen. In a corner of her mouth, clamped tight between her 6-year molars, rode the English briar pipe he had dropped. Above and around Helen's ruffled hair whirled a wreath of tobacco smoke. Even as he saw all this, she puffed out a bigger, bluer cloud. "Why did you—" Clay tried to begin, but no words came. He was done for, unable to move or speak. Helen looked, not at him, but at the giants.
"I guess I'll show you,"
she squealed at the 3 staring hulks, just as she might have defied the biggest and roughest boy in her school. One giant, the black-bearded one that seemed youngest, was first to move. Very rapidly he lifted one foot and set it down again, well behind the other. Then he retreated a second pace, a third. The giantess, who had crouched to blow upon the fire, also moved backward on all fours, rather like a tremendous and revolting crab. Helen favored these fugitives with no more than a flick of her bright eyes. She wheeled toward the grizzled one, who still stood his ground, holding Clay like a trapped frog. Rising on tiptoe, Helen hooked one hand in her father's trouser cuff.
"You put him down,"
she ordered terribly.
"or I'll blow some more smoke, and you wish you had."
She suited action to word. Above Clay sounded a great hacking cry, as the giant choked and strangled. He felt himself released, falling heavily to the ground. The odor of burning tobacco smote his nostrils. He heard the heaviest of feet scrambling and stumbling away. He heard Helen laugh in harsh triumph, as Deborah might have laughed over the fall of Sisera's army.
"They're gone, Daddy,"
she said brightly.
You shouldn't have dropped your pipe in the first place, but I remembered giants hate tobacco. I came to save you.
Mist swallowed Clay, and he fainted gratefully. When he awoke, Helen was sitting beside the great dying fire, quite unconcerned.
Did you have a nice sleep?
She asked. He rose on his elbow. How long was I like that?
Not very long. About 5 minutes, I guess.
She offered him his pipe.
It didn't make me sick a bit.
Clay got up, shakily. Helen took his hand, as though it represented to her the surest pledge of safety. They turned homeward on the trail. Helen, he said, what has happened today? Before I slept.
Oh, you mean about those giants? Why, just what you said.
She looked up at him, with a little wonder that he should not be sure. Then it had been true, among the trees of truth. She, too, had seen and known. Helen, how were they driven away?
With the magic pipe, Daddy. You know, I smoked it.
This as carefully and clearly as though she were the adult speaking to the child. Why, Helen, he said, this isn't Then he broke off. Better to be careful about talking away any protection. He asked another question. You weren't afraid?
Not with the magic pipe. You told me they hated it, and everything comes true in these woods, whether it's about giants or pipes.
Clay agreed in his heart that it was a thing not to be explained, only to tremble over his whole life long. Helen was more fortunate. 6 years old in a world of wonders and importance, to her 3 hungry giants were no more wondrous or important than many another thing. Don't tell Mommy about this, Helen, he said. We'll have it for our secret. She smiled and nodded, pleased by the word secret. Clay felt better. That would help matters now. Sometime when she was older, and mentioned the business as a childhood memory, he could get her to agree that it was a dream, grotesque, frightening, but only a dream.
Daddy,
said the little girl,
are there squirrels here too? Because I think I see one.
The Nameless Offspring by Clark Ashton Smith. Many and multiform are the dim horrors of earth, infesting her ways from the prime. They sleep beneath the unturned stone, they rise with the tree from its roots, they move beneath the sea and in subterranean places. They dwell in the inmost aditer, they emerge betimes from the shut-in sepulchre of haughty bronze and the low grave that is sealed with clay. There be some that are long known to man, and others as yet unknown that abide the terrible latter days of their revealing. Those which are the most dreadful and the loathliest of all are haply still to be declared. But among those that have revealed themselves aforetime and have made manifest their veritable presence, there is one which may not openly be named for its exceeding foulness. It is that spawn which the hidden dweller in the vaults has begotten upon mortality. From the Necronomicon of Abdul al-Hazred. 1. In a sense, it is fortunate that the story I must now relate should be so largely a thing of undetermined shadows, of half-shaped hints and forbidden inferences. Otherwise, it could never be written by human hand or read by human eye. My own slight part in the hideous drama was limited to its last act, and to me its earlier scenes were merely a remote and ghastly legend. Yet, even so, the broken reflex of its unnatural horrors has crowded out in perspective the main events of normal life, has made them seem no more than frail gossamers woven on the dark, windy verge of some unsealed abyss, some deep, half-open charnel wherein earth's nethermost corruptions lurk and fester. The legend of which I speak was familiar to me from childhood, as a theme of family whispers and headshakings, for Sir John Tremoth had been a schoolmate of my father. But I had never met Sir John, had never visited Tremoth Hall, till the time of those happenings which formed the final tragedy. My father had taken me from England to Canada when I was a small infant. He had prospered in Manitoba as an apiarist, and after his death the bee ranch had kept me too busy for years to execute a long-cherished dream of visiting my natal land and exploring its rural byways. When finally I set sail, the story was pretty dim in my memory, and Tremoth Hall was no conscious part of my itinerary when I began my motorcycle tour of the English counties. In any case, I should never have been drawn to the neighbourhood out of morbid curiosity, such as the frightful tale might possibly have evoked in others. My visit, as it happened, was purely accidental. I had forgotten the exact location of the place, and did not even dream that I was in its vicinity. If I had known, it seems to me that I should have turned aside, in spite of the circumstances that impelled me to seek shelter, rather than intrude upon the almost demoniacal misery of its owner. When I came to Tremoth Hall, I had ridden all day in early autumn through a rolling countryside with leisurely winding thoroughfares and lanes. The day had been fair, with skies of pale azure above noble parks that were tinged with the first amber and crimson of the following year. But toward the middle of the afternoon, a mist had come in from the hidden ocean across low hills, and had closed me about with its moving phantom circle. Somehow, in that deceptive fog, I managed to lose my way, to miss the milepost that would have given me my direction to the town, where I had planned to spend the ensuing night. I went on for a while at random, thinking that I should soon reach another crossroad. The way that I followed was little more than a rough lane, and was singularly deserted. The fog had darkened and drawn closer, obliterating all horizons. But from what I could see of it, the country was one of heath and boulders, with no sign of cultivation. I topped a level ridge and went down a long, monotonous slope as the mist continued to thicken with twilight. I thought that I was riding toward the west, but before me, in the wan dusk, there was no faintest gleaming or flare of colour to betoken the drowned sunset. A dank odour that was touched with salt, like the smell of sea marshes, came to meet me. The road turned at a sharp angle, and I seemed to be riding between downs and marshland. The night gathered with an almost unnatural quickness, as if in haste to overtake me, and I began to feel a sort of dim concern and alarm, as if I had gone astray in regions that were more dubious than an English county. The fog and twilight seemed to withhold a silent landscape of chill, deathly, disquieting mystery. Then, to the left of my road and a little before me, I saw a light that somehow suggested a mournful and tear-dimmed eye. It shone among blurred, uncertain masses that were like trees from a ghostland wood. A nearer mass, as I approached it, was resolved into a small lodge building, such as would guard the entrance of some estate. It was dark and apparently unoccupied. Pausing and peering, I saw the outlines of a wrought-iron gate in a hedge of untrimmed yew. It all had a desolate and forbidding air, and I felt in my very marrow the brooding chillness that had come in from the unseen marsh in that dismal, ever-coiling fog. But the light was promise of human nearness on the lonely downs, and I might obtain shelter for the night, or at least find someone who could direct me to a town or inn. Somewhat to my surprise, the gate was unlocked. It swung inward with a rusty grating sound, as if it had not been opened for a long time, and pushing my motorcycle before me, I followed a weed-grown drive toward the light. The rambling mass of a large manor house disclosed itself, among trees and shrubs whose artificial forms, like the hedge of ragged yew, were assuming a wilder grotesquerie than they had received from the hand of the topiary. The fog had turned into a bleak drizzle. Almost groping in the gloom, I found a dark door at some distance from the window that gave forth a solitary light. In response to my thrice-repeated knock, I heard at length the muffled sound of slow, dragging footfalls. The door was opened with a gradualness that seemed to indicate caution or reluctance, and I saw before me an old man, bearing a lighted taper in his hand. His fingers trembled with palsy or decrepitude, and monstrous shadows flickered behind him in a dim hallway, and touched his wrinkled features as with the flitting of ominous bat-like wings. "What do you wish, sir?" he asked. The voice, though quavering and hesitant, was far from churlish, and did not suggest the attitude of suspicion and downright inhospitality which I had begun to apprehend. However, I sensed a sort of irresolution or dubiety, and as the old man listened to my account of the circumstances that had led me to knock at that lonely door, I saw that he was scrutinizing me with a keenness that belied my first impression of extreme senility. "I knew you were a stranger in these parts," he commented when I had finished. "But might I inquire your name, sir?" "I am Henry Chaldane. Are you not the son of Mr. Arthur Chaldane?" Somewhat mystified, I admitted the ascribed paternity. "You resemble your father, sir. Mr. Chaldane and Sir John Tremoth were great friends in the days before your father went to Canada. Will you not come in, sir? This is Tremoth Hall. Sir John has not been in the habit of receiving guests for a long time, but I shall tell him that you are here, and it may be that he will wish to see you." Startled, and not altogether agreeably surprised at the discovery of my whereabouts, I followed the old man to a book-lined study whose furnishings bore evidence of luxury and neglect. Here he lit an oil lamp of antique fashion, with a dusty painted shade, and left me alone with the dustier volumes and furniture. I felt a queer embarrassment, a sense of actual intrusion, as I waited in the wan yellow lamplight. There came back to me the details of the strange, horrific, half-forgotten story I had overheard from my father in childhood years. Lady Agatha Tremoth, Sir John's wife, in the first year of their marriage, had become the victim of cataleptic seizures. The third seizure had apparently terminated in death, for she did not revive after the usual interval, and displayed all the familiar marks of the rigor mortis. Lady Agatha's body was placed in the family vaults, which were of almost fabulous age and extent, and had been excavated in the hill behind the manor house. On the day following the interment, Sir John, troubled by a queer, insistent doubt as to the finality of the medical verdict, had re-entered the vaults in time to hear a wild cry, and had found Lady Agatha sitting up in her coffin. The nailed lid was lying on the stone floor, and it seemed impossible that it could have been removed by the struggles of the frail woman. However, there was no other plausible explanation, though Lady Agatha herself could throw little light on the circumstances of her strange resurrection. Half-dazed and almost delirious, in a state of dire terror that was easily understandable, she told an incoherent tale of her experience. She did not seem to remember struggling to free herself from the coffin, but was troubled mainly by recollections of a pale, hideous, unhuman face which she had seen in the gloom on awakening from her prolonged and death-like sleep. It was the sight of this face, stooping over her as she lay in the open coffin, that had caused her to cry out so wildly. The thing had vanished before Sir John's approach, fleeing swiftly to the inner vaults, and she had formed only a vague idea of its bodily appearance. She thought, however, that it was large and white, and ran like an animal on all fours, though its limbs were semi-human. Of course, her tale was regarded as a sort of dream, or a figment of delirium induced by the awful shock of her experience, which had blotted out all recollection of its true terror. But the memory of the horrible face and figure had seemed to obsess her permanently, and was plainly fraught with associations of mind-unhinging fear. She did not recover from her illness, but lived on in a shattered condition of brain and body, and 9 months later she died after giving birth to her first child. Her death was a merciful thing, for the child, it seemed, was one of those appalling monsters that sometimes appear in human families. The exact nature of its abnormality was not known, though frightful and divergent rumors had purported to emanate from the doctor, nurses, and servants who had seen it. Some of the latter had left Ramoth Hall and had refused to return after a single glimpse of the monstrosity. After Lady Agatha's death, Sir John had withdrawn from society, and little or nothing was divulged in regard to his doings or the fate of the horrible infant. People said, however, that the child was kept in a locked room with iron-barred windows, which no one but Sir John himself ever entered. The tragedy had blighted his whole life, and he had become a recluse, living alone with one or two faithful servants, and allowing his estate to decline grievously through neglect. Doubtless, I thought, the old man who had admitted me was one of the remaining servitors. I was still reviewing the dreadful legend, still striving to recollect certain particulars that had almost passed from memory, when I heard the sound of footsteps which, from their slowness and feebleness, I took to be those of the returning manservant. However, I was mistaken, for the person who entered was plainly Sir John Tremoth himself. The tall, slightly bent figure, the face that was lined as if by the trickling of some corrosive acid, were marked with a dignity that seemed to triumph over the double ravages of mortal sorrow and illness. Somehow, though I could have calculated his real age, I had expected an old man, but he was scarcely beyond middle life. His cadaverous pallor and feeble tottering walk were those of a man who is stricken with some fatal malady. His manner, as he addressed me, was impeccably courteous and even gracious, but the voice was that of one to whom the ordinary relations and actions of life had long since become meaningless and perfunctory. "Harper tells me that you are the son of my old school friend, Arthur Chaldane," he said. "I bid you welcome to such poor hospitality as I am able to offer. I have not received guests for many years, and I fear you will find the hall pretty dull and dismal, and will think me an indifferent host. Nevertheless, you must remain, at least for the night. Harper has gone to prepare dinner for us." "You are very kind," I replied. "I fear, however, that I am intruding. If—" "Not at all," he countered firmly. "You must be my guest. It is miles to the nearest inn, and the fog is changing into a heavy rain. Indeed, I am glad to have you. You must tell me all about your father and yourself at dinner. In the meanwhile, I'll try to find a room for you, if you'll come with me." He led me to the second floor of the manor house, and down a long hall with beams and panels of ancient oak. We passed several doors which were doubtless those of bedchambers. All were closed, and one of the doors was reinforced with iron bars, heavy and sinister as those of a dungeon cell. Inevitably, I surmised that this was the chamber in which the monstrous child had been confined, and also I wondered if the abnormality still lived, after a lapse of time that must have been nearly 30 years. How abysmal, how abhorrent must have been its departure from the human type to necessitate an immediate removal from the sight of others, and what characteristics of its further development could have rendered necessary the massive bars on an oaken door which, by itself, were strong enough to have resisted the assaults of any common man or beast. Without even glancing at the door, my host went on, carrying a taper that scarcely shook in his feeble fingers. My curious reflections, as I followed him, were interrupted with nerve-shattering suddenness by a loud cry that seemed to issue from the barred room. The sound was a long, ever-mounting ululation, infra-bass at first, like the too-muffled voice of a demon, and rising through abominable degrees to a shrill, ravenous fury, as if the demon had emerged by a series of underground steps to the open air. It was neither human nor bestial. It was wholly preternatural, hellish, macabre, and I shuddered with an insupportable eeriness that still persisted when the demon voice, after reaching its culmination, had returned by reverse degrees to a profound, sepulchral silence. Sir John had given no apparent heed to the awful sound, but had gone on with no more than his usual faltering. He had reached the end of the hall, and was pausing before the second chamber from the one with the sealed door. "I'll let you have this room," he said. "It's just beyond the one that I occupy." He did not turn his face toward me as he spoke, and his voice was unnaturally toneless and restrained. I realized, with another shudder, that the chamber he had indicated as his own was adjacent to the room from which the frightful ululation had appeared to issue. The chamber to which he now admitted me had manifestly not been used for years. The air was chill, stagnant, unwholesome, with an all-pervading mustiness, and the antique furniture had gathered the inevitable increment of dust and cobwebs. Sir John began to apologize. "I didn't realize the condition of the room," he said. "I'll send Harper after dinner to do a little dusting and clearing, and put fresh linen on the bed." I protested, rather vaguely, that there was no need for him to apologize. The unhuman loneliness and decay of the old manor house, its lustrums and decades of neglect, and the corresponding desolation of its owner, had impressed me more painfully than ever, and I dared not speculate overmuch concerning the ghastly secret of the barred chamber, and the hellish howling that still echoed in my shaken nerves. Already I regretted the singular fatuity that had drawn me to that place of evil and festering shadows. I felt an urgent desire to leave, to continue my journey even in the face of the bleak autumnal rain and wind-blown darkness, but I could think of no excuse that would be sufficiently tangible and valid. Manifestly, there was nothing to do but remain. Our dinner was served in a dismal but stately room by the old man whom Sir John had referred to as Harper. The meal was plain but substantial and well cooked, and the service was impeccable. I had begun to infer that Harper was the only servant, a combination of valet, butler, housekeeper, and chef. In spite of my hunger, and the pains taken by my host to make me feel at ease, the meal was a solemn and almost funereal ceremony. I could not forget my father's story, and still less could I forget the sealed door and the baleful ululation. Whatever it was, the monstrosity still lived, and I felt a complex mingling of admiration, pity, and horror as I looked at the gaunt and gallant face of Sir John Tremoth, and reflected upon the lifelong hell to which he had been condemned, and the apparent fortitude with which he had borne its unthinkable ordeals. A bottle of excellent sherry was brought in. Over this we sat for an hour or more. Sir John spoke at some length concerning my father, of whose death he had not previously heard, and he drew me out in regard to my own affairs with the subtle adroitness of a polished man of the world. He said little about himself, and not even by hint or implication did he refer to the tragic history which I have outlined. Since I am rather abstemious, and did not empty my glass with much frequency, the major part of the heavy wine was consumed by my host. Toward the end, it seemed to bring out in him a curious vein of confidentiality, and he spoke for the first time of the ill health that was all too patent in his appearance. I learned that he was subject to that most painful form of heart disease, angina pectoris, and had recently recovered from an attack of unusual severity. "The next one will finish me," he said, "and it may come at any time, perhaps tonight." He made the announcement very simply, as if he were voicing a commonplace or venturing a prediction about the weather. Then, after a slight pause, he went on, with more emphasis and weightiness of tone. "Maybe you'll think me queer, but I have a fixed prejudice against burial or vault interment. I want my remains to be thoroughly cremated, and have left careful directions to that end. Harper will see to it that they are fulfilled. Fire is the cleanest and purest of the elements, and it cuts short all the damnable processes between death and ultimate disintegration. I can't bear the idea of some mouldy, worm-infested tomb." He continued to discourse on the subject for some time, with a singular elaboration and tenseness of manner that showed it to be a familiar theme of thought, if not an actual obsession. It seemed to possess a morbid fascination for him, and there was a painful light in his hollow, haunted eyes, and a touch of rigidly subdued hysteria in his voice as he spoke. I remembered the interment of Lady Agatha, and her tragic resurrection, and the dim, delirious horror of the vaults that had formed an inexplicable and vaguely disturbing part of her story. It was not hard to understand Sir John's aversion to burial, but I was far from suspecting the full terror and ghastliness on which his repugnance had been founded. Harper had disappeared after bringing the sherry, and I surmised that he had been given orders for the renovation of my room. We had now drained our last glasses, and my host had ended his peroration. The wind, which had animated him briefly, seemed to die out, and he looked more ill and haggard than ever. Pleading my own fatigue, I expressed a wish to retire, and he, with his invariable courtliness, insisted on seeing me to my chamber and making sure of my comfort before seeking his own bed. In the hall above, we met Harper, who was just descending from a flight of stairs that must have led to an attic or third floor. He was carrying a heavy iron pan, in which a few scraps of meat remained, and I caught an odor of pronounced gaminess, almost virtual putrescence, from the pan as he went by. I wondered if he had been feeding the unknown monstrosity, and if perhaps its food was supplied to it through a trap in the ceiling of the barred room. The surmise was reasonable enough, but the odor of the scraps, by a train of remote, half-literary association, had begun to suggest other surmises which, it would seem, were beyond the realm of possibility and reason. Certain evasive, incoherent hints appeared to point themselves suddenly to an atrocious and abhorrent whole. With imperfect success, I assured myself that the thing I had fancied was incredible to science, was a mere creation of superstitious diablerie. No, it could not be, here in England of all places, that corpse-devouring demon of oriental tales and legends, the ghoul. Contrary to my fears, there was no repetition of the fiendish howling as we passed the secret room, but I thought that I heard a measured crunching, such as a large animal would make in devouring its food. My room, though still drear and dismal enough, had been cleared of its accumulated dust and matted gossamer. After a personal inspection, Sir John left me and retired to his own chamber. I was struck by his deathly pallor and weakness as he said good night to me, and felt guiltily apprehensive that the strain of receiving and entertaining a guest might have aggravated the dire disease from which he suffered. I seemed to detect actual pain and torment beneath his careful armor of urbanity, and wondered if the urbanity had not been maintained at an excessive cost. The fatigue of my day-long journey, together with the heavy wine I had drunk, should have conduced to early slumber, but though I lay with tightly closed lids in the darkness, I could not dismiss those evil shadows, those black and charnel larvae that swarmed upon me from the ancient house. Insufferable and forbidden things besieged me with filthy talons, brushed me with noisome coils, as I tossed through eternal hours and lay staring at the grey square of the storm-darkened window. The dripping of the rain, the sough and moan of the wind, resolved themselves to a dread mutter of half-articulate voices that plotted against my peace and whispered loathfully of nameless secrets in demonian language. At length, after the seeming lapse of nocturnal centuries, the tempest died away, and I no longer heard the equivocal voices. The window lightened a little in the black wall, and the terrors of my night-long insomnia seemed to withdraw partially, but without bringing the surcease of slumber. I became aware of utter silence, and then, in the silence, of a queer, faint, disquieting sound, whose cause and location baffled me for many minutes. The sound was muffled and far off at times. Then it seemed to draw near, as if it were in the next room. I began to identify it as a sort of scratching, such as would be made by the claws of an animal on solid woodwork. Sitting up in bed and listening attentively, I realized with a fresh start of horror that it came from the direction of the barred chamber. It took on a strange resonance. Then it became almost inaudible, and suddenly, for a while, it ceased. In the interim, I heard a groan, like that of a man in great agony or terror. I could not mistake the source of the groan, which had issued from Sir John Tremoth's room, nor was I doubtful any longer as to the causation of the scratching. The groan was not repeated, but the damnable clawing sound began again, and was continued till daybreak. Then, as if the creature that had caused the noise were wholly nocturnal in its habits, the faint, vibrant rasping ceased, and was not resumed. In a state of dull, nightmarish apprehension, drugged with weariness and want of sleep, I had listened to it with intolerably straining ears. With its cessation, in the hueless livid dawn, I slid into a deep slumber, from which the muffled and amorphous spectres of the old hall were unable to detain me any longer. 2. I was awakened by a loud knocking on my door, a knocking in which even my sleep-confused senses could recognize the imperative and urgent. It must have been close upon midday, and feeling guilty at having overslept so egregiously, I ran to the door and opened it. The old manservant Harper was standing without, and his tremulous, grief-broken manner told me before he spoke that something of dire import had occurred. "I regret to tell you, Mr. Chaldane," he quavered, "that Sir John is dead. He did not answer my knock as usual, so I made bold to enter his room. He must have died early this morning." Inexpressibly shocked by his announcement, I recalled the single groan I had heard in the grey beginning of dawn. My host, perhaps, had been dying at that very moment. I recalled, too, the detestable nightmare scratching. Unavoidably, I wondered if the groan had been occasioned by fear as well as by physical pain. Had the strain and suspense of listening to that hideous sound brought on the final paroxysm of Sir John's malady? I could not be sure of the truth, but my brain seethed with awful and ghastly conjectures. With the futile formalities that one employs on such occasions, I tried to condole with the aged servant, and offered him such assistance as I could in making the necessary arrangements for the disposition of his master's remains. Since there was no telephone in the house, I volunteered to find a doctor who would examine the body and sign the death certificate. The old man seemed to feel a singular relief and gratitude. "Thank you, sir," he said fervently. Then, as if in explanation, "I don't want to leave Sir John. I promised him that I'd keep a close watch over his body." He went on to speak of Sir John's desire for cremation. It seemed that the baronet had left explicit directions for the building of a pyre of driftwood on the hill behind the hall, the burning of his remains on this pyre, and the sowing of his ashes on the fields of the estate. These directions he had enjoined and empowered the servant to carry out as soon after death as possible. No one was to be present at the ceremony, except Harper and the hired pallbearers, and Sir John's nearer relatives, none of whom lived in the vicinity, were not to be informed of his demise till all was over. I refused Harper's offer to prepare my breakfast, telling him that I could obtain a meal in the neighbouring village. There was a strange uneasiness in his manner, and I realized, with thoughts and emotions not to be specified in this narrative, that he was anxious to begin his promised vigil beside Sir John's corpse. It would be tedious and unnecessary to detail the funereal afternoon that followed. The heavy sea fog had returned, and I seemed to grope my way through a certain but unreal world as I sought the nearby town. I succeeded in locating a doctor, and also in securing several men to build the pyre and act as pallbearers. I was met everywhere with an odd taciturnity, and no one seemed willing to comment on Sir John's death, or to speak of the dark legendary that was attached to Tremoth Hall. Harper, to my amazement, had proposed that the cremation should take place at once. This, however, proved to be impracticable. When all the formalities and arrangements had been completed, the fog turned into a steady, everlasting downpour which rendered impossible the lighting of the pyre, and we were compelled to defer the ceremony. I had promised Harper that I should remain at the hall till all was done, and so it was that I spent a second night beneath that roof of accursed and abominable secrets. The darkness came on betimes. After a last visit to the village, in which I procured some sandwiches for Harper and myself in lieu of dinner, I returned to the lonely hall. I was met by Harper on the stairs as I ascended to the death chamber. There was an increased agitation in his manner, as if something had happened to frighten him. "I wonder if you'd keep me company tonight, Mr. Chaldane," he said. "It's a gruesome watch that I'm asking you to share, and it may be a dangerous one. But Sir John would thank you, I'm sure. If you have a weapon of any sort, it will be well to bring it with you." It was impossible to refuse his request, and I assented at once. I was unarmed, so Harper insisted on equipping me with an antique revolver, of which he himself carried the mate. "Look here, Harper," I said bluntly, as we followed the hall to Sir John's chamber. "What are you afraid of?" He flinched visibly at the question, and seemed unwilling to answer. Then, after a moment, he appeared to realize that frankness was necessary. "It's the thing in the barred room," he explained. "You must have heard it, sir. We've had the care of it, Sir John and I, these 28 years, and we've always feared that it might break out. It never gave us much trouble, as long as we kept it well fed, but for the last 3 nights it has been scratching at the thick oaken wall of Sir John's chamber, which is something it never did before. Sir John thought it knew that he was going to die, and that it wanted to reach his body, being hungry for other food than we had given it. That's why we must guard him closely tonight, Mr. Chaldane. I pray to God that the wall will hold, but the thing keeps on clawing and clawing like a demon, and I don't like the hollowness of the sound, as if the wall were getting pretty thin." Appalled by this confirmation of my own most repugnant surmise, I could offer no rejoinder, since all comment would have been futile. With Harper's open avowal, the abnormality took on a darker and more encroaching shadow, a more potent and tyrannic menace. Willingly would I have foregone the promised vigil, but this, of course, it was impossible to do. The bestial, diabolic scratching, louder and more frantic than before, assailed my ears as we passed the barred room. All too readily, I understood the nameless fear that had impelled the old man to request my company. The sound was inexpressibly alarming and nerve-sapping, with its grim, macabre insistence, its intimation of ghoulish hunger. It became even plainer, with a hideous, tearing vibrancy, when we entered the room of death. During the whole course of that funereal day, I had refrained from visiting this chamber, since I am lacking in the morbid curiosity which impels many to gaze upon the dead. So it was that I beheld my host for the second and last time. Fully dressed and prepared for the pyre, he lay on the chill white bed, whose heavily figured, arras-like curtains had been drawn back. The room was lit by several tall tapers, arranged on a little table in curious brazen candelabras that were greened with antiquity, but the light seemed to afford only a doubtful, dolorous glimmering in the drear spaciousness and mortuary shadows. Somewhat against my will, I gazed on the dead features, and averted my eyes very hastily. I was prepared for the stony pallor and rigor, but not for the full betrayal of that hideous revulsion, that inhuman terror and horror, which must have corroded the man's heart through infernal years, and which, with almost superhuman control, he had masked from the casual beholder in life. The revelation was too painful, and I could not look at him again. In a sense, it seemed that he was not dead, that he was still listening with agonized attention to the dreadful sounds that might well have served to precipitate the final attack of his malady. There were several chairs, dating, I think, like the bed itself, from the 17th century. Harper and I seated ourselves near the small table, and between the deathbed and the panelled wall of blackish wood, from which the ceaseless clawing sound appeared to issue. In tacit silence, with drawn and cocked revolvers, we began our ghastly vigil. As we sat and waited, I was driven to picture the unnamed monstrosity, and formless or half-formed images of charnel nightmare pursued each other in chaotic succession through my mind. An atrocious curiosity, to which I should normally have been a stranger, prompted me to question Harper, but I was restrained by an even more powerful inhibition. On his part, the old man volunteered no information or comment whatever, but watched the wall with fear-bright eyes that did not seem to waver in his palsy-nodding head. It would be impossible to convey the unnatural tension, the macabre suspense and baleful expectation of the hours that followed. The woodwork must have been of great thickness and hardness, such as would have defied the assaults of any normal creature equipped only with talons or teeth. But in spite of such obvious arguments as these, I thought momentarily to see it crumble inward. The scratching noise went on eternally, and to my febrile fancy it grew sharper and nearer every instant. At recurrent intervals, I seemed to hear a low, eager, dog-like whining, such as a ravenous animal would make when it neared the goal of its burrowing. Neither of us had spoken of what we should do, in case the monster should attain its objective, but there seemed to be an unvoiced agreement. However, with a superstitiousness of which I should not have believed myself capable, I began to wonder if the monster possessed enough of humanity in its composition to be vulnerable to mere revolver bullets. To what extent would it display the traits of its unknown and fabulous paternity? I tried to convince myself that such questions and wonderings were patently absurd, but was drawn to them again and again, as if by the allurement of some forbidden gulf. The night wore on, like the flowing of a dark, sluggish stream, and the tall funeral tapers had burned to within an inch of their verdigris-eaten sockets. It was this circumstance alone that gave me an idea of the passage of time, for I seemed to be drowning in a black eternity, motionless beneath the crawling and seething of blind horrors. I had grown so accustomed to the clawing noise in the woodwork, and the sound had gone on so long, that I deemed its ever-growing sharpness and hollowness a mere hallucination, and so it was that the end of our vigil came without apparent warning. Suddenly, as I stared at the wall and listened with frozen fixity, I heard a harsh, splintering sound, and saw that a narrow strip had broken loose and was hanging from the panel. Then, before I could collect myself or credit the awful witness of my senses, a large, semicircular portion of the wall collapsed in many splinters beneath the impact of some ponderous body. Mercifully, perhaps, I have never been able to recall with any degree of distinctness the hellish thing that issued from the panel. The visual shock, by its own excess of horror, has almost blotted the details from memory. I have, however, the blurred impression of a huge, whitish, hairless, and semi-quadruped body, of canine teeth in a half-human face, and long hyena nails at the end of forelimbs that were both arms and legs. A charnel stench preceded the apparition, like a breath from the den of some carrion-eating animal. And then, with a single nightmare leap, the thing was upon us. I heard the staccato crack of Harper's revolver, sharp and vengeful in the closed room, but there was only a rusty click from my own weapon. Perhaps the cartridge was too old. At any rate, it had misfired. Before I could press the trigger again, I was hurled to the floor with terrific violence, striking my head against the heavy base of the little table. A black curtain, spangled with countless fires, appeared to fall upon me and to blot the room from sight. Then all the fires went out, and there was only darkness. Again, slowly, I became conscious of flame and shadow, but the flame was bright and flickering, and seemed to grow ever more brilliant. Then my dull, doubtful senses were sharply revived and clarified by the acrid odor of burning cloth. The features of the room returned to vision, and I found that I was lying huddled against the overthrown table, gazing toward the deathbed. The guttering candles had been hurled to the floor. One of them was eating a slow circle of fire in the carpet beside me, and another, spreading, had ignited the bed curtains, which were flaring swiftly upward to the great canopy. Even as I lay staring, huge ruddy tatters of the burning fabric fell upon the bed in a dozen places, and the body of Sir John Tremoth was ringed about with starting flames. I staggered heavily to my feet, dazed and giddy with the fall that had hurled me into oblivion. The room was empty, except for the old manservant, who lay near the door, moaning indistinctly. The door itself stood open, as if someone or something had gone out during my period of unconsciousness. I turned again to the bed, with some instinctive, half-formed intention of trying to extinguish the blaze. The flames were spreading rapidly, were leaping higher, but they were not swift enough to veil from my sickened eyes the hands and features, if one could any longer call them such, of that which had been Sir John Tremoth. Of the last horror that had overtaken him, I must forbear explicit mention, and I would that I could likewise avoid the remembrance. All too tardily had the monster been frightened away by the fire. There is little more to tell. Looking back once more, as I reeled from the smoke-laden room with Harper in my arms, I saw that the bed and its canopy had become a mass of mounting flames. The unhappy baronet had found in his own death-chamber the funeral pyre for which he had longed. It was nearly dawn when we emerged from the doomed manor house. The rain had ceased, leaving a heaven lined with high and dead grey clouds. The chill air appeared to revive the aged manservant, and he stood feebly beside me, uttering not a word, as we watched an ever-climbing spire of flame that broke from the sombre roof of Tremoth Hall and began to cast a sullen glare on the unkempt hedges. In the combined light of the fireless dawn and the lurid conflagration, we both saw at our feet the semi-human, monstrous footprints, with their mark of long and canine nails that had been trodden freshly and deeply in the rain-wet soil. They came from the direction of the manor house and ran toward the heath-clad hill that rose behind it. Still without speaking, we followed the steps. Almost without interruption, they led to the entrance of the ancient family vaults, to the heavy iron door in the hillside that had been closed for a full generation by Sir John Tremoth's order. The door itself swung open, and we saw that its rusty chain and lock had been shattered by a strength that was more than the strength of man or beast. Then, peering within, we saw the clay-touched outline of the unreturning footprints that went downward into mausolean darkness on the stairs. We were both weaponless, having left our revolvers behind us in the death chamber, but we did not hesitate long. Harper possessed a liberal supply of matches, and looking about, I found a heavy billet of water-soaked wood, which might serve in lieu of a cudgel. In grim silence, with tacit determination, and forgetful of any danger, we conducted a thorough search of the well-nigh interminable vaults, striking match after match as we went on in the musty shadows. The traces of ghoulish footsteps grew fainter as we followed them into those black recesses, and we found nothing anywhere but noisome dampness and undisturbed cobwebs and the countless coffins of the dead. The thing that we sought had vanished utterly, as if swallowed up by the subterranean walls. At last, we returned to the entrance. There, as we stood blinking in the full daylight with grey and haggard faces, Harper spoke for the first time, saying in his slow, tremulous voice, "Many years ago, soon after Lady Agatha's death, Sir John and I searched the vaults from end to end, but we could find no trace of the thing we suspected. Now, as then, it is useless to seek. There are mysteries which, God helping, will never be fathomed. We know only that the offspring of the vaults has gone back to the vaults. There may it remain." Silently, in my shaken heart, I echoed his last words and his wish.
The Black Kiss by Robert Bloch and Henry Kuttner. They rise in green robes roaring from the green hells of the sea, where fallen skies and evil hues and eyeless creatures be. Chesterton, Lepanto. 1. The Thing in the Waters. Graham Dean nervously crushed out his cigarette and met Dr. Hedwig's puzzled eyes. "I've never been troubled like this before," he said. "These dreams are so oddly persistent. They're not the usual haphazard nightmares. They seem, I know it sounds ridiculous, they seem planned." "Dreams planned? Nonsense." Dr. Hedwig looked scornful. "You, Mr. Dean, are an artist, and naturally of impressionable temperament. This house at San Pedro is new to you, and you say you've heard wild tales. The dreams are due to imagination and overwork." Dean glanced out of the window, a frown on his unnaturally pale face. "I hope you're right," he said softly. "But dreams shouldn't make me look like this, should they?" A gesture indicated the great blue rings beneath the young artist's eyes. His hands indicated the bloodless pallor of his gaunt cheeks. "Overwork has done that, Mr. Dean. I know what has happened to you better than you do yourself." The white-haired physician picked up a sheet covered with his own scarcely decipherable notes and scrutinized it in review. "You inherited this house at San Pedro a few months ago, eh? And you moved in alone to do some work?" "Yes. The seacoast there has some marvelous scenes." For a moment, Dean's face looked youthful once more, as enthusiasm kindled its ashy fires. Then he continued, with a troubled frown, "But I haven't been able to paint lately. Not seascapes, anyway. It's very odd. My sketches don't seem quite right anymore. There seems to be a quality in them that I don't put there." "A quality, did you say?" "Yes, a quality of malignness, if I can call it that. It's indefinable. Something behind the picture takes all the beauty out. And I haven't been overworking these last weeks, Dr. Hedwig." The doctor glanced again at the paper in his hand. "Well, I disagree with you there. You might be unconscious of the effort you expend. These dreams of the sea that seem to worry you are meaningless, save as an indication of your nervous condition." "You're wrong." Dean rose suddenly. His voice was shrill. "That's the dreadful part of it. The dreams are not meaningless. They seem cumulative and planned. Each night they grow more vivid, and I see more of that green, shining place under the sea. I get closer and closer to those black shadows swimming there. Those shadows that I know aren't shadows, but something worse. I see more each night. It's like a sketch I'd block out, gradually adding more and more until... Hedwig watched his patient keenly. He suggested, until? But Dean's tense face relaxed. He had caught himself just in time. No, Dr. Hedwig, you must be right. It's overwork and nervousness, as you say. If I believe what the Mexicans had told me about Morella Godolpho, well, I'd be mad and a fool. Who is this Morella Godolpho? Some woman who has been filling you with foolish tales? Dean smiled. No need to worry about Morella. She was my great-great-grandaunt. She used to live in the San Pedro house and started the legends, I think. Hedwig had been scribbling on a slip of paper. Well, I see, young man. You heard these legends. Your imagination ran riot. You dreamed. This prescription will fix you up. Thanks. Dean took the paper, lifted his hat from the table, and started for the door. In the doorway, he paused, smiling wryly. But you're not quite correct in thinking the legends started me dreaming, Doctor. I began to dream before I learned the history of the house. And with that, he went out. Driving back to San Pedro, Dean tried to understand what had happened to him, but always he came up against a blank wall of impossibility. Any logical explanation wandered off into a tangle of fantasy. The one thing he could not explain, which Dr. Hedwig had not been able to explain, was the dreams. The dreams started soon after he came into his legacy, this ancient house north of San Pedro, which had so long stood deserted. The place was picturesquely old, and that attracted Dean from the first. It had been built by one of his ancestors when the Spaniards still ruled California. One of the Deans, the name was Denner then, had gone to Spain and returned with a bride. Her name was Morella Godolpho, and it was this long-vanished woman about whom all the subsequent legends centered. Even yet there were wrinkled, toothless Mexicans in San Pedro who whispered incredible tales of Morella Godolpho, she who had never grown old, and who had a weirdly evil power over the sea. The Godolphos had been among the proudest families of Granada, but furtive legends spoke of their intercourse with the terrible Moorish sorcerers and necromancers. Morella, according to these same hinted horrors, had learned uncanny secrets in the black towers of Moorish Spain, and when Denner had brought her as his bride across the sea, she had already sealed a pact with dark powers, and had undergone a change. So ran the tales, and they further told of Morella's life in the old San Pedro house. Her husband had lived for 10 years or more after the marriage, but rumors said that he no longer possessed a soul. It is certain that his death was very mysteriously hushed up by Morella Godolpho, who went on living alone in the great house beside the sea. The whispers of the peons were hereafter monstrously augmented. They had to do with the change in Morella Godolpho, the sorcerous change which caused her to swim far out to sea on moonlit nights, so that watchers saw her white body gleaming amidst the spray. Men bold enough to gaze from the cliffs might catch glimpses of her then, sporting with queer sea creatures that gamboled about her in the black waters, nuzzling her with shockingly deformed heads. These creatures were not seals or any known form of submarine life, it was averred, although sometimes bursts of chuckling, gobbling laughter could be heard. It is said that Morella Godolpho had swam out there one night, and that she never came back. But thereafter the laughter was louder from afar, and the sporting amidst the black rocks continued, so that the tales of the early peons had been nourished down to the present day. Such were the legends known to Dean. The facts were sparse and inconclusive. The old house had fallen into decrepitude, and was only occasionally rented through the years. These rentals had been as short as they were infrequent. There was nothing definitely wrong with the house between White's Point and Point Fermin, but those who had lived there said that the crashing of the surf sounded subtly different when heard through windows that overlooked the sea, and, too, they dreamed unpleasantly. Sometimes the occasional tenants had mentioned with peculiar horror the moonlit nights when the sea became altogether too clearly visible. At any rate, occupants often vacated the house hastily. Dean had moved in immediately after inheriting, because he had thought the place ideal for painting the scenes he loved. He had learned the legend and the facts behind it later, and by this time his dreams had started. At first they had been conventional enough, though, oddly, all centered about the sea which he so loved. But it was not the sea he loved that he knew in sleep. The Gorgons lived in his dreams. Scylla writhed hideously across dark and surging waters where harpies flew, screaming. Weird creatures crawled sluggishly up from the black, inky depths where eyeless, bloated sea beasts dwelt. Gigantic and terrible leviathans leapt and plunged, while monstrous serpents squirmed a strange obeisance to a mocking moon. Foul and hidden horrors of the sea's depths engulfed him in sleep. This was bad enough, but it was only a prelude. The dreams began to change. It was almost as though the first few formed a definite setting for the greater terrors to come. From the mythic images of old sea gods, another vision emerged. It was inchoate at first, taking definite form and meaning very slowly over a period of several weeks, and it was this dream which Dean now feared. It had occurred generally just before he awoke, a vision of green, translucent light in which dark shadows swam slowly. Night after night, the limpid emerald glow grew brighter, and the shadows twisted into a more visible horror. These were never clearly seen, although their amorphous heads held a strangely repellent, recognizable quality for Dean. Presently, in this dream of his, the shadow creatures would move aside, as though to permit the passage of another. Swimming into the green haze would come a coiling shape. Whether similar to the rest or not, Dean could not tell, for his dream always ended there. The approach of this last shape always caused him to awake in a nightmare paroxysm of terror. He dreamt of being somewhere under the sea, amid swimming shadows with deformed heads, and each night one particular shadow was coming closer and closer. Each day now, when he awoke with the cold sea wind of early dawn blowing through the windows, he would lie in a lazy, languid mood till long past daybreak. When he rose these days he felt inexplicably tired, and he could not paint. This particular morning, the sight of his haggard face in the mirror had forced him to visit a physician. But Dr. Hedwig had not been helpful. Nevertheless, Dean filled the prescription on the way home. A swallow of the bitter, brownish tonic strengthened him somewhat, but as he parked his car, the feeling of depression settled down on him again. He walked up to the house, still puzzled and strangely afraid. Under the door was a telegram. Dean read it with a puzzled frown. Just learned you are living in San Pedro House. Vitally important you vacate immediately. Show this cable to Dr. Makoto Yamada, 17 Buena Street, San Pedro. Am returning via airplane. See Yamada today. Michael Lee. Dean read the message again, and a flash of remembrance came to him. Michael Lee was his uncle, but he had not seen the man for years. Lee had been a puzzle to the family. He was an occultist, and spent most of his time delving in far corners of the earth. Occasionally, he dropped from sight for long periods of time. The cable Dean held was sent from Calcutta, and he supposed that Lee had recently emerged from some spot in the interior of India to learn of Dean's inheritance. Dean searched his mind. He recalled now that there had been some family quarrel about this very house years ago. The details were no longer clear, but he remembered that Lee had demanded the San Pedro house be razed. Lee had given no sane reasons, and when the request was refused, he had dropped out of sight for a time. And now came this inexplicable cablegram. Dean was tired from his long drive, and the unsatisfactory interview with the doctor had irritated him more than he had realized. Nor was he in the mood to follow his uncle's cabled request and undertake the long journey to Buena Street, which was miles away. The drowsiness which he felt, however, was normal, healthy exhaustion, unlike the languor of recent weeks. The tonic he had taken was of some value after all. He dropped into his favorite chair by the window that overlooked the sea, rousing himself to watch the flaming colors of the sunset. Presently, the sun dropped below the horizon, and grey dusk crept in. Stars appeared, and far to the north he could see the dim lights of the gambling ships off Venice. The mountains shut off his view of San Pedro, but a diffused pale glow in that direction told him that the New Barbary was awakening into a roaring, brawling life. Slowly, the face of the Pacific brightened. A full moon was rising above the San Pedro hills. For a long time Dean sat quietly by the window, his pipe forgotten in his hand, staring down at the slow swells of the ocean, which seemed to pulse with a mighty and alien life. Gradually, drowsiness crept up and overwhelmed him. Just before he dropped into the abyss of sleep, there flashed into his mind Da Vinci's saying, "The two most wonderful things in the world are a woman's smile and the motion of mighty waters." He dreamed, and this time it was a different dream. At first only blackness, and a roaring and thundering as of angry seas, and oddly mingled with this was the hazy thought of a woman's smile, and a woman's lips, pouting lips, softly alluring. But strangely, the lips were not red. No, they were very pale, bloodless, like the lips of a thing that had long rested beneath the sea. The misty vision changed, and for a flashing instant Dean seemed to see the green and silent place of his earlier visions. The shadowy black shapes were moving more quickly behind the veil, but this picture was of but a second's duration. It flashed out and vanished, and Dean was standing alone on a beach he recognized in his dream, the sandy cove beneath the house. The salt breeze blew coldly across his face, and the sea glistened like silver in the moonlight. A faint splash told of a sea thing that broke the surface of the waters. To the north, the sea washed against the rugged surface of the cliff, barred and speckled with black shadows. Dean felt a sudden, inexplicable impulse to move in that direction. He yielded. As he clambered over the rocks, he was suddenly conscious of a strange sensation, as though keen eyes were focused upon him, eyes that watched and warned. Vaguely in his mind rose up the gaunt face of his uncle, Michael Lee, the deep-set eyes glowing. But swiftly this was gone, and he found himself before a deeper niche of blackness in the cliff face. Into it he knew he must go. He squeezed himself between two jutting points of rock, and found himself in utter, dismal darkness. Yet somehow he was conscious that he was in a cave, and he could hear water lapping nearby. All about him was a musty salt odor of sea decay, the fetid smell of sunless ocean caves and holds of ancient ships. He stepped forward, and, as the floor shelved sharply downward, stumbled and fell headlong into icy, shallow water. He felt, rather than saw, a flicker of swift movement, and then abruptly hot lips were pressed against his. Human lips, Dean thought, at first. He lay on his side in the chill water, his lips against those responsive ones. He could see nothing, for all was lost in the blackness of the cave. The unearthly lure of those invisible lips thrilled through him. He responded to them, pressed them fiercely, gave them what they were avidly seeking. The unseen waters crawled against the rocks, whispering warning. And in that kiss strangeness flooded him. He felt a shock and a tingling go through him, and then a thrill of sudden ecstasy, and swift on its heels came horror. Black, loathsome foulness seemed to wash his brain, indescribable but fearfully real, making him shudder with nausea. It was as though unutterable evil were pouring into his body, his mind, his very soul, through the blasphemous kiss on his lips. He felt loathsome, contaminated. He fell back. He sprang to his feet. And Dean saw, for the first time, the ghastly thing he had kissed, as the sinking moon sent a pale shaft of radiance creeping through the cave mouth. For something rose up before him, a serpentine and seal-like bulk that coiled and twisted and moved toward him, glistening with foul slime. And Dean screamed and turned to flee with nightmare fear tearing at his brain, hearing behind him a quiet splashing, as though some bulky creature had slid back into the water. 2. A visit from Dr. Yamada. He awoke. He was still in his chair before the window, and the moon was paling before the greyness of dawn. He was shaken with nausea, sick and shuddering with the shocking realism of his dream. His clothing was drenched with perspiration, and his heart hammered furiously. An immense lethargy seemed to have overwhelmed him, making it an intense effort to rise from the chair and stagger to a couch, on which he flung himself to doze fitfully for several hours. A sharp pealing of the doorbell roused him. He still felt weak and dizzy, but the frightening lethargy had somewhat abated. When Dean opened the door, a Japanese man standing on the porch began a bobbing little bow, a gesture that was abruptly arrested as the sharp black eyes focused on Dean's face. A little hiss of indrawn breath came from the visitor. Dean said irritably, "Well, do you want to see me?" The other was still staring, his thin face sallow beneath a stiff thatch of grey hair. He was a small, slender man, with his face covered with a fine-spun web of wrinkles. After a pause, he said, "I am Dr. Yamada." Dean frowned, puzzled. Abruptly, he remembered his uncle's cable of the day before. An odd, unreasonable irritation began to mount within him, and he said, more brusquely than he had intended, "This isn't a professional call, I hope. I've already—" "Your uncle, you are Mr. Dean, cabled me. He was rather worried." Dr. Yamada glanced around almost furtively. Dean felt distaste stare within him, and his irritation increased. "My uncle is rather eccentric, I'm afraid. There's nothing for him to worry about. I'm sorry you had your trip for nothing." Dr. Yamada did not seem to take offense at Dean's attitude. Rather, a strange expression of sympathy showed for a moment on his small face. "Do you mind if I come in?" he asked, and moved forward confidently. Short of barring his way, Dean had no means of stopping him, and ungraciously led his guest to the room where he had spent the night, motioning him to a chair while he busied himself with a coffee-pot. Yamada sat motionless, silently watching Dean. Then, without preamble, he said, "Your uncle is a great man, Mr. Dean." Dean made a non-committal gesture. "I have seen him only once. He is one of the greatest occultists of this day. I, too, have studied psychic lore, but beside your uncle, I am a novice." Dean said, "He is eccentric. Occultism, as you term it, has never interested me." The little Japanese man watched him impassively. "You make a common error, Mr. Dean. You consider occultism a hobby for cranks. No." He held up a slender hand. "Your disbelief is written in your face. Well, it is understandable. It is an anachronism, an attitude handed down from the earliest times, when scientists were called alchemists and sorcerers and burned for making pacts with the devil. But actually there are no sorcerers, no witches. Not in the sense that man understands these terms. There are men and women who have acquired mastery over certain sciences, which are not wholly subject to mundane physical laws." There was a little smile of disbelief on Dean's face. Yamada went on quietly. "You do not believe because you do not understand. There are not many who can comprehend, for who wish to comprehend this greater science which is not bound by earthly laws. But here is a problem for you, Mr. Dean." A little spark of irony flickered in the black eyes. "Can you tell me how I know you have suffered from nightmares recently?" Dean jerked around and stood staring. Then he smiled. "As it happens, I know the answer, Dr. Yamada. You physicians have a way of hanging together, and I must have let something slip to Dr. Hedwig yesterday." His tone was offensive, but Yamada merely shrugged slightly. "Do you know your Homer?" he asked, apparently irrelevantly, and at Dean's surprised nod went on. "And Proteus? You remember the old man of the sea who possessed the power of changing his shape? I do not wish to strain your credulity, Mr. Dean, but for a long time students of the dark lore have known that behind this legend there exists a very terrible truth. All the tales of spirit possession, of reincarnation, even the comparatively innocuous experiments in thought transference point to the truth. Why do you suppose folklore abounds with tales of men who have been able to change themselves into beasts, werewolves, hyenas, tigers, the seal men of the Eskimos? Because these tales are founded on truth. I do not mean," he went on, "that the actual physical metamorphosis of the body is possible so far as we know, but it has long been known that the intelligence, the mind, of an adept can be transferred to the brain and body of a satisfactory subject. Animals' brains are weak, lacking the power of resistance, but men are different, unless there are certain circumstances." As he hesitated, Dean proffered the Japanese man a cup of coffee. Coffee was generally brewing in the percolator these days, and Yamada accepted it with a formal little bow of acknowledgment. Dean drank his coffee in 3 hasty gulps, and poured more. Yamada, after a polite sip, put the cup aside and leaned forward earnestly. "I must ask you to make your mind receptive, Mr. Dean. Don't allow your conventional ideas of life to influence you in this matter. It is vitally to your interest that you listen carefully to me and understand. Then, perhaps—" He hesitated, and again threw that oddly furtive glance at the window. "Life in the sea has followed different lines from life on land. Evolution has followed a different course. In the great deeps of the ocean, life utterly alien to ours has been discovered. Luminous creatures which burst when exposed to the lighter pressure of the air, and in those tremendous depths forms of life completely inhuman have been developed. Life forms that the uninitiated mind may think impossible. In Japan, an island country, we have known of these sea dwellers for generations. Your English writer, Arthur Machen, has told a deep truth in his statement that man, afraid of these strange beings, has attributed to them beautiful or pleasantly grotesque forms which in reality they do not possess. Thus we have the Nereids and Oceanids, but nevertheless man could not fully disguise the true foulness of these creatures. Therefore there are legends of the Gorgons, of Scylla and the Harpies, and, significantly, of the mermaids and their soullessness. No doubt you know the mermaid tale, how they long to steal the soul of a man and draw it out by means of their kiss." Dean was at the window now, his back to the Japanese man. As Yamada paused, he said tonelessly, "Go on." "I have reason to believe," Yamada went on very quietly, "that Morella Godolpho, the woman from Alhambra, was not fully human. She left no issue. These things never have children. They cannot." "What do you mean?" Dean had turned and was facing the Japanese man, his face a ghastly white, the shadows beneath his eyes hideously livid. He repeated harshly, "What do you mean? You can't frighten me with your tales, if that's what you're trying to do. My uncle wants me out of this house for some reason of his own. You're taking this means of getting me out, aren't you? Eh?" "You must leave this house," Yamada said. "Your uncle is coming, but he may not be in time. Listen to me. These creatures, the sea-dwellers, envy man, sunlight and warm fires and the fields of earth, things which the sea-dwellers cannot normally possess. These things and love. You remember what I said about mind transference, the possession of a brain by an alien intelligence? That is the only way these things can attain that which they desire, and know the love of man or woman. Sometimes, not very often, one of these creatures succeeds in possessing itself of a human body. They watch always. When there is a wreck, they go there, like vultures to a feast. They can swim phenomenally fast. When a man is drowning, the defenses of his mind are down, and sometimes the sea-dwellers can thus acquire a human body. There have been tales of men saved from wrecks who ever after were oddly changed. Morella Godolpho was one of these creatures. The Godolphos knew much of the dark lore, but used it for evil purposes, the so-called black magic. And it was, I think, through this that sea-dweller gained power to usurp the brain and body of the woman. A transference took place. The mind of the sea-dweller took possession of Morella Godolpho's body, and the intelligence of the original Morella was forced into the terrible form of that creature of the abyss. In time, the human body of the woman died, and the usurping mind returned to its original shell. The intelligence of Morella Godolpho was then ejected from its temporary prison and left homeless. That is true death.
Dean shook his head slowly, as though in denial, but did not speak, and inexorably Yamada kept on. For years, generations since then, she has dwelt in the sea, waiting. Her power is strongest here, where she once lived. But, as I told you, only under unusual circumstances can this transference take place. The tenants of this house might be troubled with dreams, but that would be all. The evil being had no power to steal their bodies. Your uncle knew that, or he would have insisted that the place be immediately destroyed. He did not foresee that you would ever live here. The little Japanese man bent forward, and his eyes were twin points of black light. You do not need to tell me what you have undergone in the past month. I know. The sea-dweller has power over you. For one thing, there are bonds of blood, even though you are not directly descended from her. And your love for the ocean, your uncle spoke of that. You live here alone with your paintings and your imaginative fancies. You see no one else. You are an ideal victim, and it was easy for that sea horror to become en rapport with you. Even now you show the stigmata. Dean was silent, his face a pale shadow amidst the darker ones in the corners of the room. What was the man trying to tell him? What were these hints leading up to? Remember what I have said. Dr. Yamada's voice was fanatically earnest. That creature wants you for your youth, your soul. She has lured you in sleep with visions of Poseidonus, the twilight grottos in the deep. She has sent you beguiling visions at first, to hide what she was doing. She has drained your life forces, weakened your resistance, waiting until she is strong enough to take possession of your brain. I have told you what she wants, what all these hybrid horrors raven for. She will reveal herself to you in time, and when her will is strong upon you in slumber, you will do her bidding. She will take you down into the deep, and show you the kraken-fouled gulfs where these things bide. You will go willingly, and that will be your doom. She may lure you to their feasts there, the feast they hold upon the drowned things they find floating from wrecked ships. And you will live such madness in your sleep because she rules you. And then when you have become weak enough, she will have her desire. The sea thing will usurp your body and walk once more on earth. And you will go down into the darkness where once you dwelt in dreams forever. Unless I am mistaken, you have already seen enough to know that I speak truth. I think that this terrible moment is not so far off, and I warn you that alone you cannot hope to resist the evil, only with the aid of your uncle and me. Dr. Yamada stood up. He moved forward and confronted the dazed youth face to face. In a low voice he asked, In your dreams, has the thing kissed you? For a heartbeat, there was utter silence. Dean opened his mouth to speak, and then a curious little warning note seemed to sound in his brain. It rose, like the quiet roaring of a conch shell, and a vague nausea assailed him. Almost without volition, he heard himself saying, "No." Dimly, as though from an incredibly far distance, he heard Yamada suck in his breath as if surprised. Then the Japanese man said, "That is good, very good. Now listen, your uncle will be here soon. He has chartered a special plane. Will you be my guest until he arrives?" The room seemed to darken before Dean's eyes. The form of the Japanese man was receding, dwindling. Through the window the surf sound came crashing, and it rolled on in waves through Dean's brain. In its thunder a thin, insistent whispering penetrated. "Accept," it murmured. "Accept." And Dean heard his own voice accept Yamada's invitation. He seemed incapable of coherent thought. That last dream haunted him, and now Dr. Yamada's disturbing story. He was ill, that was it, very ill. He wanted very much to sleep. Now, a flood of darkness seemed to wash up and engulf him. Gratefully, he allowed it to sweep through his tired head. Nothing existed but the dark and a restless lapping of unquiet waters. Yet he seemed to know, in an odd way, that he was still, some outer part of him, conscious. He strangely realized that he and Dr. Yamada had left the house, were entering a car, and driving a long way. He was, with that strange external other self, talking casually to the doctor, entering his house in San Pedro, drinking, eating, and all the while his soul, his real being, was buried in waves of blackness. Finally, a bed. From below, the surf seemed to blend into the blackness that engulfed his brain. It spoke to him now, as he rose stealthily and clambered out of the window. The fall jarred his outer self considerably, but he was on the ground outside without injury. He kept in the shadows as he crept away down to the beach, the black, hungry shadows that were like the darkness surging through his soul. 3 dreadful hours. With a shock, he was himself once more, completely. The cold water had done it, the water in which he found himself swimming. He was in the ocean, borne on waves as silver as the lightning that occasionally flashed overhead. He heard thunder, felt the sting of rain. Without wondering about the sudden transition, he swam on, as though fully aware of some planned destination. For the first time in over a month, he felt fully alive, actually himself. There was a surge of wild elation in him that defied the facts. He no longer seemed to care about his recent illness, the weird warnings of his uncle and Dr. Yamada, and the unnatural darkness that had previously shadowed his mind. In fact, he no longer had to think. It was as though he were being directed in all his movements. He was swimming parallel with the beach now, and with curious detachment he observed that the storm had subsided. A pale, fog-like glow hovered over the lashing waters, and it seemed to beckon. The air was chill, as was the water, and the waves high. Yet Dean experienced neither cold nor fatigue, and when he saw the things that waited for him on the rocky beach just ahead, he lost all perception of himself in a crescendo of mounting joy. This was inexplicable, for they were the creatures of his last and wildest nightmares. Even now he did not see them plainly as they sported in the surf, but there were dim suggestions of past horror in their tenebrous outlines. The things were like seals, great, fish-like, bloated monsters with pulpy, shapeless heads. These heads rested on columnar necks that undulated with serpentine ease, and he observed, without any sensation other than curious familiarity, that the heads and bodies of the creatures were a sea-bleached white. Soon he was swimming in among them, swimming with peculiar and disturbing ease. Inwardly he marveled with a touch of his former feeling that he was not now horrified by the sea beasts in the least. Instead, it was almost with a feeling of kinship that he listened to their strange, low gruntings and cackles, listened and understood. He knew what they were saying, and he was not amazed. He was not frightened by what he heard, though the words would have sent abysmal horror through his soul in the previous dreams. He knew where they were going and what they meant to do when the entire group swam out into the water once more. Yet he did not fear. Instead, he felt a strange hunger at the thought of what was to come, a hunger that impelled him to take the lead as the things with undulant swiftness glided through the inky waters to the north. They swam with incredible speed, yet it was hours before a seacoast loomed up through the murk, lit by a blinding flare of light from offshore. Twilight deepened to true darkness over the water, but the offshore light burned brightly. It seemed to come from a huge wreck in the waves just off the coast, a great hulk floating on the waters like a crumpled beast. There were boats gathered around it, and floating flares of light that revealed the scene. As though by instinct, Dean, with the pack behind him, headed for the spot. Swiftly and silently they sped, their slimy heads blurred in the shadows to which they clung as they circled the boats and swam in toward the great crumpled shape. Now it was looming above him, and he could see arms flailing desperately as man after man sank below the surface. The colossal bulk from which they leaped was a wreck of twisted girders, in which he could trace the warped outline of a vaguely familiar shape. And now, with curious disinterest, he swam lazily about, avoiding the lights bobbing over the water as he watched the actions of his companions. They were hunting their prey. Leering muzzles gaped for the drowning men, and lean talons raked bodies from the darkness. Whenever a man was glimpsed in shadows not yet invaded by rescue boats, one of the sea things craftily snared his victim. In a little while they turned and slowly swam away, but now many of the creatures clutched a grisly trophy at their squamous breasts. The pale white limbs of drowning men trailed in the water as they were dragged off into the darkness by their captors. To the accompaniment of low, carrion laughter, the beast swam away back down the coast. Dean swam with the rest. His mind was again a blur of confusion. He knew what that thing in the water was, and yet he could not name it. He had watched those hateful horrors snare doomed men and drag them off to the deep, yet he had not intervened. What was wrong? Even now, as he swam with frightening agility, he felt a call he could not fully understand, a call that his body was answering. The hybrid things were gradually dispersing. With eerie splashings, they disappeared below the surface of the gelid black waters, pulling with them the dreadfully limp bodies of the men, pulling them down to the blackness biding beneath. They were hungry. Dean knew it without thinking. He swam on along the coast, impelled by his curious urge. That was it. He was hungry, and now he was going for food. Hours of steady swimming southward. Then the familiar beach, and above it a lighted house which Dean recognized, his own house on the cliff. There were figures descending the slope now. 2 men with torches were coming down to the beach. He must not let them see him. Why, he did not know, but they must not. He crawled along the beach, keeping close to the water's edge. Even so, he seemed to move very swiftly. The men with the torches were some distance behind him now. Ahead loomed another familiar outline, a cave. He had clambered over these rocks before, it seemed. He knew the pits of shadow that speckled the cliff rock, and knew the narrow passage of stone through which he now squeezed his prostrate body. Was that someone shouting, far away? Darkness and a lapping pool. He crawled forward, felt chill waters creep over his body. Muffled by distance,
came an insistent shouting from outside the cave. "Graham! Graham Dean!" Then the smell of dank sea foulness was in his nostrils, a familiar, pleasant smell. He knew where he was now. It was the cave where in his dream he had kissed the sea thing. It was the cave in which... He remembered now. The black blur lifted from his brain, and he remembered all. His mind bridged the gap, and he once again recalled coming here earlier this very evening, before he had found himself in the water. Morella Godolpho had called him here. Here her dark whispers had guided him at twilight, when he had come from the bed at Dr. Yamada's house. It was the siren song of the sea creature that had lured him in dreams. He remembered how she had coiled about his feet when he entered, flung her sea-bleached body up until its inhuman head had loomed close to his own, and then the hot, pulpy lips had pressed against his. The loathsome, slimy lips had kissed him again. Wet, dank, horribly avid kiss. His senses had drowned in its evil, for he knew that this second kiss meant doom. "The sea dweller will take your body," Dr. Yamada had said, and the second kiss meant doom. All this had happened hours ago. Dean shifted around in the rocky chamber to avoid wetting himself in the pool. As he did so, he glanced down at his body for the first time that night, glanced down with an undulating neck at the shape he had worn for 3 hours in the sea. He saw the fish-like scales, the scabrous whiteness of the slimy skin, saw the veined gills. He stared into the waters of the pool then, so that the reflection of his face was visible in the dim moonlight that filtered through fissures in the rocks. He saw all. His head rested on the long reptilian neck. It was an anthropoid head with flat contours that were monstrously inhuman. The eyes were white and protuberant. They bulged with the glassy stare of a drowning thing. There was no nose, and the center of the face was covered with a tangle of wormy blue feelers. The mouth was worst of all. Dean saw pale white lips in a dead face, human lips, lips that had kissed his own, and now they were his own. He was in the body of the evil sea thing that had once harbored the soul of Morella Godolpho. At that moment, Dean would gladly have welcomed death, for the stark, blasphemous horror of his discovery was too much to bear. He knew about his dreams now, and the legends. He had learned the truth, and paid a hideous price. He recalled vividly how he had recovered consciousness in the water and swam out to meet those others. He recalled the great black hulk from which drowning men had been taken in boats, the shattered wreck on the water. What was it Yamada had told him? When there is a wreck, they go there, like vultures to a feast. And now, at last, he remembered what had eluded him that night, what that familiar shape on the waters had been. It was a crashed Zeppelin. He had gone swimming into the wreckage with those things, and they had taken men. 3 hours, God! Dean wanted very much to die. He was in the sea body of Morella Godolpho, and it was too evil for further life. Morella Godolpho, where was she? And his own body, the shape of Graham Dean. A rustling in the shadowy cavern behind him proclaimed the answer. Graham Dean saw himself in the moonlight, saw his body, line for line, hunching furtively past the pool, in an effort to creep away unobserved. Dean's flippered fins moved swiftly. His own body turned. It was ghastly for Dean to see himself reflected where no mirror existed. Ghastlier still to see that in his face there no longer were his eyes. The sly, mocking stare of the sea creature peered out at him from behind their fleshy mask, and they were ancient, evil. The pseudo-human snarled at him and tried to dodge off into the darkness. Dean followed, on all fours. He knew what he must do. That sea-thing, Morella, she had taken his body during that last black kiss, just as he had been forced into hers. But she had not yet recovered enough to go out into the world. That was why he had found her still in the cave. Now, however, she would leave, and his Uncle Michael would never know. The world would never know either what horror stalked its surface, until it was too late. Dean, his own tragic form hateful to him now, knew what he must do. Purposefully, he maneuvered the mocking body of himself into a rocky corner. There was a look of fright in those gelid eyes. A sound caused Dean to turn, pivoting his reptilian neck. Through glazed fish eyes, he saw the faces of Michael Lee and Dr. Yamada. Torches in hand, they were entering the cave. Dean knew what they would do, and he no longer cared. He closed in on the human body that housed the soul of the sea beast, closed in with the beast's own flailing flippers, seized it in its own arms, and menaced it with its own teeth near the creature's white, human neck. From behind him he heard shouts and cries at his very back, but Dean did not care. He had a duty to perform, an atonement. Through the corner of his eye, he saw the barrel of a revolver as it glinted in Yamada's hand. Then came 2 bursts of stabbing flame, and the oblivion Dean craved. But he died happy, for he had atoned for the black kiss. Even as he sank into death, Graham Dean had bitten with animal fangs into his own throat, and his heart was filled with peace as, dying, he saw himself die. His soul mingled in the 3rd black kiss of death. It Walks by Night by Henry Kuttner. Johann leaned heavily against a tall obelisk of discolored marble, his fever-weakened body trembling with exhaustion. The graveyard was a dim, black sea, with pale slabs and monoliths standing in irregular ranks all about him. He fumbled with the slide of his lantern, and a white beam sprang out vividly, etching the man's gaunt figure in sharp detail. Deep shadows lay in the hollows of his cheeks and beneath his dilated, smouldering eyes. His face had an angry flush, which betrayed the fever blazing in his brain. Fever that had burned away lifelong barriers of fear and driven him to this ancient burying ground where few would have ventured after sundown. For, as all men knew, a horror dwelt among these tombs, an ancient horror that had come down through the generations. There were tales of a thing that walked by night among the graves, so that sometimes when men came searching in broad daylight, they found new graves opened, coffins ruthlessly torn apart, and the bodies gone. Occasionally, one of the villagers would bury his kin in the cemetery at Crucian, 20 miles to the north. But this was seldom done, since the horror had dwelt in the graveyard longer than the oldest greybeard, and a kind of hopeless apathy hung, like a sombre pall, over the village. Moreover, there was a tale that, long ago, in the year of the Great Plague, when all bodies were burned for fear of spreading the pestilence, something had come forth from among the tombs and had burst nightly into the houses on the outskirts of the village. A dozen people had vanished without a trace, and at last, in desperation, the plague-infected corpses had been interred in the old burying ground. Thereafter the village slept in peace, although now and then a lone traveller or itinerant peddler would disappear, never to be seen again. Still, as the older men whispered among themselves, it was lucky that worse things did not befall. But now Johann was driven by a fierce urge that made him disregard the ancient menace that lurked among the tombs. He had come for his wife. Elsa, his bride for scarcely a year, had been buried while Johann lay delirious
raving with the same fever that had proved fatal to his wife. Believing him asleep, his cousin's wife had talked too freely, and Johann had learned that Elsa had been interred in the devil-haunted graveyard beyond the outskirts of the village. His beloved Elsa, daughter of the ancient Orba clan, that could trace their fathers back through Torn and Taxis, the prey of the ghoul. Horror had lent Johann strength to leave his bed and slip unnoticed from his cousin's house, pausing only to snatch his pistol and a lantern. Now he drew the weapon from his shirt, as footsteps sounded suddenly nearby. A man came into view in the starlight, gingerly picking his way among the graves. As Johann recognized Karl, his cousin, he thrust the pistol back into his shirt and let the light from his lantern flare out. The newcomer gave a startled cry, quickly muffled. Karl stepped into the one splotch of light, relief plain in his pale face. "Johann, I thought, what are you doing here? You can't help Elsa now." Johann looked away abruptly, his mouth working. Karl put a hand on his cousin's shoulder, but Johann shook it off impatiently. "It's your fault, Karl," he accused, his eyes dark with anger. "You let them bury Elsa here, in this devil-ridden place." Karl made a placating gesture. "What could I do? I told them you would not—" "I know." The resentment was gone from Johann's voice. It was very bitter now. "Our heads have been bowed beneath a yoke for a long time. Too long, Karl. Elsa shall not. She has been buried a week now. You have no shovel." It was true. Johann had had no time to procure one during his flight. He said slowly, "I can guard her grave, at any rate. You can go back to the village and get shovels." Karl was silent. After a moment, Johann laughed mirthlessly. "Bring the shovels tomorrow, then," he jeered. "You won't be afraid to come here in daylight." Stung, Karl responded, "It's not daylight now. Come home, Johann. We can get Elsa tomorrow. One more night won't... It's dangerous, Johann. They say it's been walking again." Johann shrugged with a nonchalance he did not feel. He was shivering in the chill wind that blew over the neglected graves. His fears, forgotten in his delirium, were slowly creeping back to torment him. But he pushed them resolutely aside. "I'm not afraid," he growled, and moved forward among the graves, his lantern sending out a beam of yellow light that rested on lichen-stained stone and the worm-eaten and weathered surface of wooden slabs and crosses. Once he tripped over a fallen tombstone, half buried in the ground, and would have fallen had not Karl caught him. Karl began a frantic protest, which his cousin did not hear. Johann was staring intently into the gloom. He took a few hasty steps, and at his feet loomed the black gulf of an open grave. He sent the beam of the lantern darting down into it, and saw that the coffin lid was broken and shattered, and that the sarcophagus itself was empty. Even before the light searched out the inscription upon the wooden slab at the head of the violated grave, he knew what would be painted there. Beside him, Karl caught his breath in a gasp of fear, but Johann merely stood silent, swaying a little, the dank wind blowing coldly across his wet face, and his thoughts were a chaotic swirl in which horror and grief and anger were mingled. Out of his poignant grief and his horror, fierce anger racked his feverish brain with surges of red rage that shook him with their intensity. Under his shirt, he felt the bulk of the pistol, and he gripped it fiercely. Elsa, her slim white body the prey of the ghoul. Suddenly, all Johann's fear was forgotten in his blinding, overwhelming anger. Karl was tugging at his arm. He turned to meet his cousin's frightened gaze. "Johann, what are you waiting for? We can't stay here.
It has walked again. No! Johann barked out the word fiercely, his eyes blazing. Elsa! It's too late, Johann. Elsa is gone. Is it too late for vengeance? Johann asked quietly, and at his words Karl shrank back, stark amazement in his face. Vengeance? He whispered the word fearfully, and a shudder racked him. He shot an apprehensive glance into the dimness about them. Then he said, still whispering, You are mad, Johann. Deliberately, Johann drew out his pistol. Very well, I am mad. But, Karl, if it were your wife— He broke off, his lips twitching, and when he resumed, his voice was chill with inflexible purpose. Listen to me, Karl. I'm going to make someone, God, man, or devil, suffer for this crime. He glanced at the black gulf of the violated grave. So go home, Karl. You can't help me now. Karl opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. His eyes flashed past Johann's shoulder, and into them sprang a look of panic fear. With a strangled scream, he spun about and went racing off, his footsteps disquietingly loud in the chill, empty silence. Johann turned quickly. At first, he saw nothing in the dim starlight. Then, far away, he saw a faint movement among the tombs. There was a flicker of motion in the distance, where an ancient mausoleum stood all alone on the side of a little hillock. He waited, scarcely breathing for a time, but there was no further movement at the distant tomb. Karl's footsteps had died away, and there was not a sound to be heard. Johann fingered the pistol irresolutely. Then he thrust it back in his shirt and hurriedly made his way among the graves to where the mausoleum stood on the knoll, pale and ominous in the starlight. The tomb was incredibly ancient and weathered, overgrown with a thick coating of lichen that draped it like grey spider-webs. There was an inscription above the door, but save for the single word, Maranatha, it was illegible. Johann did not pause to examine it after he saw that the great stone portal was open. With cold rage surging within him, he stepped over the threshold and sent the light darting about the tomb. It was empty. Bare, granite walls met his gaze, but there was a door of rusted metal set in the further wall, and this was ajar. Johann squeezed through the gap and held the lantern high. He was in an empty passage, paved with great stone slabs sloping down into the side of the little hill. A faint, whispering sound, like the slithering of water over jagged rocks, was audible, and Johann cautiously advanced. The passage turned and twisted in the rock, but it continued to descend steeply, and twice Johann passed the black mouths of side tunnels. Now the faint whispering was louder. He recognized the sound of voices, but there was a curious squeaking and snarling that puzzled him, a sound such as might originate in a nest of rats. The cold tide of sanity was slowly rising in Johann's brain, and misgivings were beginning to assail him. But the thought of Elsa's looted grave enabled him to force them out of his mind. He replaced the slide on the lantern and moved forward in utter darkness, feeling his way and straining to distinguish an intelligible word from the babble of chatterings and whisperings that he heard. Slowly he advanced, sliding his hand along the wall, and suddenly a voice sounded distinct and clear above the sly mutterings. It was harsh and grating, possessing a curious quality of depth, as though it came from far underground, and it said distinctly, "Has been gone long." A wave of fear came rushing up to overwhelm Johann, and he clung desperately to the thought of Elsa and his vengeance. Fighting back his horror,
He edged forward, and as though at a signal, a sudden silence fell. Johann caught a whisper. "We'll be back to bring us food." Behind him, there was a rustling, swiftly growing louder. In the blackness, nothing was visible, but Johann flung himself flat against the wall. The rustling swept past him, and for a moment an overpowering stench filled his nostrils. He was conscious that something had passed close to him, something he could not see for the darkness, although he felt sick and giddy with its passing. He leaned against the wall, grateful for its support, and the whisperings and shrillings broke out afresh, this time with an eerie note of disappointment. A new voice spoke, a quiet, emotionless voice with a dreadful feline purr in it. "No food could I find, my ancestors. No food or drink. Must we go hungry?" Another voice whined, and a plaintive series of cries burst from the grim darkness that pulsed with unseen, horrific life. "You must feed us! It is your duty." "We are unable," a deeper voice spoke. "You must fulfill your trust. Each of us fed our ancestors who could not feed themselves, and it is your duty to find us food. When in time you too become like us, unable to go forth to search out the new graves, you will expect the next heir to fulfill his duty." "I found food for you 2 nights ago," the other voice purred, and Johann caught his breath and shuddered in the shielding darkness. "It is your trust and your privilege," the deep voice cut in, brittle and harsh. "This is the curse and the blessing of our blood, that knows no other life after death." "But there are so many," cried the other, and a stifled gasp of fear came from Johann's stiff lips. A taut silence fell, and the man turned to ice. Past him went a soft rustling, almost brushing his numb body, swiftly dying away. Then there was no sound, only the charnel darkness that pressed silently upon him, and behind him he heard a heavy thud. Stung into life, Johann spun about, and in an agony of fear went racing back through the twisted corridor, back to the open air and the clean starlight. He felt a heavy blow on his chest and staggered back, almost falling, the lantern slipping from his grasp and thudding to the ground. As he tottered there in the blackness, he heard the abominable rustling go past him again and fade into silence. Gasping, uttering little moans, he fell on his hands and knees and groped frantically for the lantern. For a moment it eluded his clutching fingers, and Johann felt the skin of his back crawling with the expectation of an attack. Then, with a sob of relief, he found the lantern and snatched off the slide, praying that it had not gone out. It had not. A yellow beam of light pitilessly illuminated the thing that had halted Johann's flight, the great door in the tomb, the door by which he had entered this Cimmerian cave of night and horror. But now it was no longer ajar. He realized what had happened. The rustling that had passed him, the heavy thud. The creature, Johann dared not give it a name, had slipped past him and closed the door to prevent his escape. Breathing heavily, Johann put down the lantern and examined the door. There were no handles or knobs. It was a bare, rivet-studded plate of rusty metal. He braced his shoulder against it and strained until his head swam, but he could not move the door. Again, swift anger mounted within him, and the thought of Elsa supplied the spark to the tinderbox of his fury. With rage and fear battling within him, he drew out his pistol, examined it to see if the moisture of the vault had damped the charge, and slowly began to retrace his steps. He paused occasionally to flash the light behind him, but nothing lurked at his heels, nothing but the black tunnel mouths that seemed to watch him ominously. And presently he saw that he was on the threshold of an archway that led into silent, unstirring darkness. Twice Johann went forward, and twice he retreated in fear. At last he raised the pistol and stepped over the threshold, swiftly flashing the light about the great vault in which he stood. For a moment he thought he was confronting an array of mummies, withered and dry. They were lying against the walls in grotesque postures, a dozen brown, wrinkled bodies, some of them merely skeletons with wrinkled dark skin stretched over their bones. The floor was buried beneath a carpet of bones, ranging in colour from crumbled black to shining white bones on which the marks of gnawing were dreadfully evident. At Johann's feet a skull grinned up at him in a grim mockery of mirth. As the light gleamed through the tomb, a frightful rustling and a stir went over the withered bodies. There was a monstrous shifting and squirming, and Johann saw moving what should never move, what should always lie silent and still and dead under the coffin lid. The things crawled about like maggots, blindly creeping away from the light, and Johann still stood there, the lantern in one hand and his pistol in the other, without moving a muscle or turning his eyes from the charnel horror before him. The light gleamed on cold, shiny eyes staring at him speculatively. Behind him came the rustling, and Johann swung about, his light stabbing out through the blackness. Far down the passage, a vague figure was moving toward him, slowly, implacably. Behind him came an outburst of abominable squeakings and whistlings. Johann jerked up his pistol, the thought of Elsa steadying his hand. He would wait until the thing was almost upon him, and then... But his fear betrayed him. The crash of the explosion sent sharp echoes rolling through the vault. The dreadful form did not pause. It glided onward, silently, save for the faint rustling of garments, and Johann took a step back. Something clutched at his ankle, and in a frenzy of fear he kicked free. For a second he had turned his back on the half-seen figure that was inexorably drawing nearer, and when he swung about, it was almost upon him. There was no time to reload the pistol. Johann flung up his arm as though the lantern had been a weapon. Two things happened almost simultaneously. A purring, gloating voice came from the dim form, and it said triumphantly, "We shall not go hungry." And the light revealed the face of the approaching horror, and Johann dropped the lantern and began to scream over and over, "Elsa! Elsa!"
The Red God Laughed by Thorp McClusky. The city was dead. New York, the greatest monument mankind ever reared upon the face of earth, was dead. No creature of flesh and blood moved along her thousands of miles of multiple tiered streets, glanced appreciatively and pridefully outward and downward through dizzying azure depths from the gleaming pinnacles of her 4,000-foot towers, strolled or lounged in her unkempt and silent parks. No silvery aircraft or fish-shaped stratoships hurtled purposefully above her Himalayan skyline. No birds or insects sang or buzzed in her wondrous hanging gardens. Grass and weeds grew in crevices in her disintegrating pedestrian walks, and fat angleworms crawled unafraid through their lush and fecund tangle. Dry and chalk-white skeletons littered the streets, the skeletons of men and women and children and birds and domestic beasts. They strewed the dust-carpeted corridors of great buildings. They were even to be found, had any sentient creature been there to search for them, in the huge and hermetically sealed gas shelters beneath the city. The gas had lingered longer than the men who had designed and built those tremendous caverns had believed possible. Thirst and oxygen starvation had snuffed out lives the gas had not been able to touch. It was not only that way in New York and in the Americas, it was the same all over Earth. Even the yellow men, big and little, who had first perfected the gas and immediately deluged the Americas with it in that last decade of the 21st century, had also perished. For the gas had been easy to analyze and easier to manufacture. Dying, the Americas had struck back at the yellow men with their own weapon, and gasping doom had encircled the globe. All races of mankind, all air-breathing creatures, save only the deep-sea fishes and the worms that chanced to be far underground, and perhaps a few toads and frogs, encapsulated and dormant in dry lake or riverbeds, had perished. The last human creature had been dead for over 3 years, and the last bird or beast or insect for perhaps an additional 6 months, when, at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning on June 8th, in the year, according to Occidental reckoning, 2097, Thorp the Seeker brought his 14-million-ton neutronium-hulled spaceship into Earth's atmosphere, and, having already observed New York's towers and minarets from halfway around the globe, set her down as lightly as a drifting feather in a cradle of granite rocks near the southern boundary of that rectangular stretch of greenery men knew as Central Park. And as he set his ship down gently, careful to avoid crushing the green vegetation, in Thorp the Seeker's curious soul there was a great gladness, for Thorp knew that his quest was ended. It had been a long and a lonely search, spanning reaches of space that light will not cross in 20,000 years. It had begun beyond the hub of our stellar galaxy, and the years of Thorp's journeying were to the life of a man as the age of the pyramids is to a single day. Spawn of the innermost planet of a blue-white dwarf sun deep hidden in the globular cluster in Messier 2, Thorp resembled in no way save one any of the diversified forms of life which have evolved upon Earth down the millenniums since the red heat died from her surface rocks and permitted her seas to form. Because of that single resemblance, Thorp had begun his search. Only because of it had he finally arrived upon Earth. Water. Thorp, like a man, required water. The mechanical processes of his existence and of the existence of his kind depended upon an unfailing supply of water. And upon Thorp's homeworld the water was almost gone. Thorp well knew, when he began his quest, the odds against his succeeding. To every 100,000 suns, there was but one, and perhaps not even one, with planets. To every 1,000 planets, perhaps there was one sufficiently supplied with water, and suitable for colonization by his kind. There were 100 million chances to 1 of Thorp's finding, anywhere in the galaxy, that which he sought. And the other galaxies, even the big near one in Andromeda, were too far away. And now the quest was ended. Thorp's selection of Sol as a star worthy of investigation had not been haphazard. While still beyond the white star Alpha in the constellation of the Centaur, he had noted that this modest yellow-white sun was slightly unstable, slightly variable, a star that fluctuated, though to only a minor degree, through a regularly recurrent cycle. That periodicity might mean almost anything. It might mean that the star was on the verge of blowing up. It might be caused by the resultant of the gravitational attraction of attendant planets, or it might be merely the subsiding spasms of some ancient solar malaise. From Alpha Centauri, Thorp set his course for Sol. He was 15 billions of miles beyond the orbit of that planet men have named Pluto, when the steadily increasing intensity of Sol's illumination, actuating certain mechanisms, awakened him from the state of completely suspended animation in which he voyaged from star to star. He awoke instantly, feeling neither refreshed nor enervated, and lacking any recollection whatsoever of the passage of time. His first and almost automatic activity was to reduce the velocity of his spacecraft from a hyper-Einsteinian interstellar speed to a pace more suitable to interplanetary cruising. During those first brief, waking moments, his ship travelled solward 1 billion miles. Immediately, he had slowed the rush of his ship toward the yellow sun. He applied himself to his instruments, and saw at once that the slightly nervous star was plagued with a swarm of planets. The outermost planets were too cold to support life. Their atmospheres were raging seas of ammonia and methane. The planet nearest the luminary was without atmosphere. The next was heavily blanketed with an atmosphere, which was, however, full of carbon dioxide. The third planet, the one with the pear-shaped moon, had an atmosphere dripping with water vapor. Thorp, looking upon Earth, knew that his quest was ended. His ship safely landed on Sol's third planet. Thorp began a series of routine tasks. He analyzed the luminary's radiation and the planet's atmosphere with highly encouraging results. His kind could adapt themselves to life on Earth. Next, he attempted communication with the green-growing life, but although he quickly learned that Earth's vegetation possessed a dim, vague consciousness, it was obvious that its intelligence was too meager, too instinctive for the development of original thought. Obviously, Earth's vegetation could not have constructed the aimless, sprawling city in the midst of which Thor's spaceship lay. It was probable, therefore, that the city's creators were temporarily absent. Perhaps they were nocturnal creatures who lived during the day in underground recesses and came to the surface of the planet only at night. Perhaps they were migratory. There were any number of plausible explanations of their absence. His preliminary scrutiny of the immediate environment satisfactorily concluded, and no motile form of Earth life having yet appeared to inspect his ship, attempt communication with him, or perhaps dispute his peaceful invasion of the planet, Thorp determined to inspect one of the buildings which towered skyward, only 1/4 mile away to the southward. Prudently burdening himself with a variety of apparatus and weapons, which he distributed among several of his smaller tentacles, he emerged through the airlock in his ship's hull and crawled rapidly, and with a slight tingling of anticipation, toward the nearest of the buildings. He had proceeded only a short distance when he came upon a bleached mass of human bones, half hidden in the rank grass. Examining them, he realized at once that they had lived, but, as his own amorphous race lacked rigid skeletal structure of any sort, and any conception of motile life being hampered by rigidity was alien to him, he had difficulty in imagining what the creature had been like in life. He concluded that it had been nowhere near as motile as himself, perhaps little more motile than the vegetation. He also noted, however, and with considerable approval, a number of fat, grey earthworms, and he paused and attempted to communicate with them, quickly discovering, however, that, though they knew fear and hunger, they were incapable of abstract thought. Continuing onward, he ascended a long ramp which debouched upon a broad street. On the opposite side of the street, the buildings began. The street was littered with a large number of small, egg-shaped wheeled mechanisms. Examining one of these through its windows of fused silica and metallic oxides, Thorp saw that it contained 2 skeletons. It was obvious to him now that these dead were of the species which had built the city. Why were they dead? And had all of their kind throughout the city perished? Or were some left alive? Uneasily, Thorp, who realized only too well that the unknown doom which had snuffed out this bony form of Earth life might also be inimical to himself, paused and made additional tests. Reassurance of a sort returned to him, as he determined that Earth's atmosphere was remarkably stable, and that there were no electrical or atomic mechanisms operating within the field of his apparatus. Nevertheless, he determined to proceed with extreme wariness. Crossing the broad street, Thorp approached the base of the nearest building and examined as much of the interior as he could see through the dusty, though still partly transparent windows. The structure was internally subdivided into many small cubicles profusely equipped with furnishings, which were, for the most part, incomprehensible to Thorp. He would have to see those objects in use before he could understand their purpose. His bulk was too great to permit him to enter through any of the windows, but there were large doors which, after a brief examination, he easily opened. Entering the building, he found himself in a chamber of considerable size, which, like the smaller cells, was luxuriously furnished. The walls of this room were profusely panelled with mirrors, which created the illusion of a chamber twice as large as actuality. Why this illusion should be necessary or even desirable was utterly beyond Thvor's comprehension. Reflecting surfaces in utter dissociation with any recognizable form of apparatus whatsoever were a complete enigma to him. The floor of this chamber was littered with no less than 20 skeletons. Some were still partly clothed in garments of vegetable, mineral, and animal fiber. Some wore loose-fitting circlets of metallic alloys around their tinier appendages. Many of the circlets held geometrically carved bits of crystallized carbon in claw-like sockets. Lifting and examining a small, glass-dialed mechanism which lay beside one of the skeletons, Thor discovered that it was operated by an internal spring, which had, however, lost its tension. He rewound the spring by turning a ratcheted pin provided for the purpose, and discovered that the mechanism produced a regular pulsation, while 3 small indicators beneath a transparent portion of the mechanism's shell revolved at proportionate though greatly dissimilar velocities. Correctly assuming that the mechanism was a device for measuring the passage of time, Thvol replaced the watch beside the skeleton of its owner and glided toward the deeper recesses of the chamber. Here he discovered a number of doors arranged in an orderly row, and, investigating one which was not fully closed and which slid open easily, he found that it opened upon a chimney-like well. Within the well were a number of taut steel cables which supported a square metal cage at a level slightly beneath the door. Thvol had opened the cage, Thvol saw at once, was designed to be raised and lowered from level to level of the building. Far above, a tiny pinpoint of brilliant light told Thvol that the well extended to the top of the building. He instantly determined to ascend the shaft and view the city from that vantage point. He squirmed up the elevator shaft like a gargantuan knot of writhing serpents, and, reaching the elevator motors, squeezed upward past them and into a small, many-windowed chamber. Here, an iron door provided egress to the roof of the building. Thvol opened the door and squirmed through. On the roof of the building, in the clean, sharp sunlight, Thvol put down his instruments and weapons and sedately capered. This world was so fair, so bountiful, and, as yet, so undeveloped. There was no doubt now that its ruling race were exceedingly primitive, but they possessed intelligence of a sort, too. If they proved peaceable and friendly, Thvol's people could teach them so much, in return for a bit of the planet's desert land and a single lake of water. Probably the first boon Thvol's kind would confer upon this world's people would be conquest of the plague which had slain the city's inhabitants. Yes, that would certainly be done first. The roof on which Thvol stood was flat and surrounded by a low parapet. It was encumbered by only 2 objects, the small structure which housed the elevator motors and a huge torpedo-shaped steel cylinder which lay near a corner of the parapet. Some of the parapet bricks were broken, and there was a long, dull scar on the roof. Obviously the cylinder had been dropped from a low altitude, had struck the parapet a glancing blow, and had then slithered across the roof. What was the thing, and why had it been dropped on this roof? Thor slowly circled the object, scrutinizing it intently. He saw that, except for a short, stubby rod protruding from its pear-shaped nose, it was utterly without external moving parts of any kind. But the rod looked like a control of some sort. Thvol first rotated the rod, then, when nothing happened, he tugged on it, and finally pressed on it. That brought results. The rod moved inward easily, and instantly 4 small valves opened in the cylinder's circumference, and a thick grey gas poured forth and mingled with the atmosphere. For an instant, Thvol hunched there motionless, watching the gas ooze viscidly from the metal cylinder and vanish in the clean, still air. Then, in a lightning flash of utter comprehension, he understood the whole cryptic pattern. The silent city, the dead everywhere, the significance of the gas bomb that was now pouring its lethal fumes into the surrounding atmosphere. Instantly, he darted for the open door and the elevator shaft. He never reached that gaping well. He detected no odor. There was no warning pain. But abruptly the flat roof was heaving and billowing like a swirling sea. Vertigo danced in his alien brain. An intense blackness deepened before his single 1,000-faceted eye, and strength and life went swiftly together from his boneless tentacles. Thus Thor the Seeker died, and the knowledge that on Earth, the third planet of a minor sun, deep sunk in the thinning haze of stars 20,000 light-years beyond the galaxy's axis, were the environmental conditions and the water his people required so desperately, died with him. And on Earth the frogs and fishes were now the highest remaining forms of sentient life. But Mars, the red god, laughed. For though on Earth the men who had deified him and honored him with a name no longer lived to speak that name, he had just claimed his last and perhaps his most significant sacrifice. The Outsider by H.P. Lovecraft. That night the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests with shade and form, of witch and demon and large coffin worm, will long be nightmared. Keats. Unhappy is he, to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon awed watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken, and yet I am strangely content, and cling desperately to those sere memories, when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages and having high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled-up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used sometimes to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief, nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower, which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined, and could not be ascended, save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person, except myself, or anything alive but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying like the castle. To me, there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that strode some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events, and thought them more natural than the colored pictures of living beings which I found in many of the mouldy books. From such books I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all those years, not even my own. For although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak aloud. My aspect was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle,
and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to the youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat, and under the dark, mute trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, and would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forest. Once I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went farther from the castle, the shade grew denser, and the air more filled with brooding fear, so that I ran frantically back, lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. So through endless twilights I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for. Then, in the shadowy solitude, my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I lifted entreating hands to the single black ruined tower that reached above the forest into the unknown outer sky, and at last I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding day. In the dank twilight I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung perilously to small footholds leading upward. Ghastly and terrible was that dead, stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined, and deserted, and sinister with startled bats whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly and terrible still was the slowness of my progress, for climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill as of haunted and venerable mould assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light, and would have looked down had I dared. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me, and vainly groped with one free hand for a window embrasure, that I might peer out and above, and try to judge the height I had attained. All at once, after an infinity of awesome, sightless crawling up that concave and desperate precipice, I felt my head touch a solid thing, and I knew I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of floor. In the darkness I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. Then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall could give, till finally my testing hand found the barrier yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab or door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and as my hands went higher I knew that my climb was for the nonce ended, since the slab was the trap-door of an aperture leading to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower, no doubt the floor of some lofty and capacious observation chamber. I crawled through carefully, and tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in the latter attempt. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the eerie echoes of its fall, but hoped when necessary to pry it open again. Believing I was now at a prodigious height, far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled about for windows, that I might look for the first time upon the sky and the moon and stars of which I had read. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shelves of marble, bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected, and wondered what hoary secrets might abide in this high apartment, so many eons cut off from the castle below. Then, unexpectedly, my hands came upon a doorway, where hung a portal of stone, rough with strange chiselling. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength I overcame all obstacles, and dragged it open inward. As I did so, there came to me the purest ecstasy I have ever known, for shining tranquilly through an ornate grating of iron, and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from the newly found doorway, was the radiant full moon, which I had never before seen save in dreams
and in vague visions I dared not call memories. Fancying now that I had attained the very pinnacle of the castle, I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door, but the sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but which I did not open for fear of falling from the amazing height to which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. Most demoniacal of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had before undergone could compare in terror with what I now saw, with the bizarre marvels that sight implied. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops seen from a lofty eminence, there stretched around me on a level through the grating nothing less than the solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church, whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out upon the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light, and not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was, or what my surroundings might be, though as I continued to stumble along I became conscious of a kind of fearsome latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch out of that region of slabs and columns, and wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows, where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across a swift river where crumbling, mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a venerable ivied castle in a thickly wooded park, maddeningly familiar, yet full of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in, and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings existed to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and sending forth sound of the gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in and saw an oddly dressed company indeed, making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I had never, seemingly, heard human speech before, and could guess only vaguely what was said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that brought up incredibly remote recollections. Others were utterly alien. I now stepped through the low window into the brilliantly lighted room, stepping as I did so from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered, there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I had ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when there descended upon the whole company a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every face and evoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamour and panic several fell in a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly in their race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. The cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment, alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me unseen. At a casual inspection, the room seemed deserted, but when I moved toward one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there, a hint of motion beyond the golden-arched doorway leading to another and somewhat similar room.
As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly, and then, with the first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation revolted me almost as poignantly as its noxious cause. I beheld in full, frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable, and unmentionable monstrosity which had, by its simple appearance, changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and desolation, the putrid, dripping eidolon of unwholesome revelation, the awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world, yet to my horror I saw in its eaten-away and bone-revealing outlines a leering, abhorrent travesty on the human shape, and in its mouldy, disintegrating apparel, an unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. I was almost paralyzed, but not too much so to make a feeble effort toward flight, a backward stumble which failed to break the spell in which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes, bewitched by the glassy orbs which stared loathsomely into them, refused to close, though they were mercifully blurred, and showed the terrible object but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling. As I did so, I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing, whose hideous, hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself yet able to throw out a hand to ward off the fetid apparition which pressed so close, when in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness and hellish accident, my fingers touched the rotting, outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed down upon my mind a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle and the trees, and recognized the altered edifice in which I now stood. I recognized, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos there is balm as well as bitterness, and that balm is nepenthe. In the supreme horror of that second I forgot what had horrified me, and the burst of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream I fled from that haunted and accursed pile, and ran swiftly and silently in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble and went down the steps, I found the stone trapdoor immovable, but I was not sorry, for I had hated the antique castle and the trees. Now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of Nephron Ka, in the sealed and unknown valley of Hadoth by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any gaiety, save the unnamed feasts of Night Tokris beneath the great pyramid. Yet in my new wildness and freedom I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. For although nepenthe has calmed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century and among those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within that great gilded frame, stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished glass. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the Join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,